There is a city that rises from the edge of a great river, a place where water and land have always been in conversation, where the Mississippi curves like a crescent moon laid gently on its side, and everything that follows comes from that bend, that meeting of current and earth. The air here feels different, heavier somehow, as if it holds within it the breath of centuries. The moisture that drifts up from the water mingles with something older, something that has settled into the very ground, into the worn bricks of narrow streets, into the iron lacework that decorates balconies like frozen music. New Orleans, the name itself carries a weight, a history written in layers, each one pressing down upon the next, creating something dense and rich, like sediment at the bottom of the river. Waiting to be discovered, I find myself walking through the idea of this place, not as it exists in any single moment, but as it has existed across time, a city that was never meant to be, built in defiance of nature, of logic, of everything that should have prevented its existence. And yet, here it stands. Here it has always stood, improbable and inevitable all at once. The French Quarter breathes with age, its buildings leaning slightly, as if tired from standing so long. The balconies extend over the banquettes below, those wide sidewalks that have absorbed the footsteps of so many pirates and merchants, enslaved people and free people of color, soldiers and nuns, each one leaving something behind, invisible but present. Somewhere a fountain trickles, water moving over stone, the sound echoing softly in a hidden courtyard. These courtyards exist throughout the old neighborhoods, secret gardens tucked behind walls, places where banana trees grow improbably large, where ferns cascade from hanging baskets, where the outside world feels very far away. The light here has a particular quality, especially in late afternoon, when the sun slants through the moisture in the air and everything glows, golden and hazy, the shadows stretching long across the cobblestones, pooling in doorways, collecting beneath the galleries that line Royal Street and Chartres Street, streets whose names remember France, remember a time before this was America. And there is music here, always has been, drifting from somewhere you cannot quite locate, the sound of a horn perhaps, or voices raised in harmony, music that seems to emerge from the city itself, from its foundations, as essential as the bricks and the river. But beneath all of this, beneath the romance and the beauty, there runs a deeper current, a history more complex than any simple story could contain. This is a place built on contradictions, on the labor of those who were not free, on the meeting of cultures that did not always meet peacefully, on the collision of European ambition and African resilience and Native American knowledge, all of it blending, sometimes violently, sometimes beautifully, into something entirely new. The river determined everything. Its presence shaped not just the geography, but the destiny of all who came here. The Mississippi carried ships from across the ocean, brought trade goods and human cargo, connected this crescent of land to the wider world, and occasionally, when the mood struck, it rose up and reminded everyone who truly held power here. To understand New Orleans is to understand that it exists in conversation with forces larger than itself. The river, the lake, the Gulf not far beyond, the tropical storms that sweep up from the Caribbean, the summer heat that turns the air to soup, the winter rains that come sudden and drenching. Nature here is not background. It is participant, shaping and reshaping the story constantly. And so I begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can come, when this bend in the river was cypress, swamp, and marsh, when the only people here were Kitimacha and Choctaw, when no one had yet imagined building a European city in such an unlikely place, when the future was still unwritten, and everything that would follow was simply potential, hovering in the humid air, waiting. The Chitimacha called the river Malbantia, the great water road, and they knew its moods, knew when it would rise and when it would recede, knew which lands would flood and which would hold. They had lived with this river for thousands of years before any European ship appeared on the horizon, understanding what the French and Spanish would spend centuries trying to learn, that the Mississippi was not something to be controlled, only negotiated with. When René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, reached the mouth of the river in 1682, he claimed all the land drained by the Mississippi for France, an empire of water and soil that he named Louisiana, after King Louis XIV, the Sun King, who would never see this place, who could not imagine the reality of these cypress swamps, these mosquito-thick bayous, this landscape that defied European categories, but claiming land and settling it are different endeavors entirely, and for nearly 40 years the mouth of the Mississippi remained largely in the hands of those who had always known it. The French built a few tentative outposts, but the river kept its secrets, kept its power. It was not until 1718 that Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, a man who had spent years in the region, who understood at least some of what the land demanded, chose a site for a permanent settlement, a crescent-shaped bend in the river about 100 miles from the Gulf, high ground, relatively speaking, protected somewhat by the curve of the water, or so he hoped. The Compagnie d'Occident, John Law's ambitious company that had been granted control of Louisiana, approved the plan, and the city was named La Nouvelle-Orléans, honoring Philippe d'Orléans, the regent of France, a man who, like the king, would never walk these streets, never feel the particular weight of the air, never understand what had been created in his name. The early settlers arrived to find precisely what one might expect: swampland and marsh, stands of cypress rising from water, palmettos and cane, and heat, a heat that European bodies were not designed to withstand, summer temperatures that transformed the simplest tasks into ordeals. And with the heat came mosquitoes, clouds of them, bringing yellow fever and malaria, diseases that would shape the city's story as surely as the river itself. The first streets were laid out in a grid, a very French notion of order imposed upon a landscape that had no interest in straight lines. The Place d'Armes formed the center, facing the river, and around it the blocks took shape. Royal Street and Bourbon Street, Chartres Street and Dauphine Street, names that carried France across the ocean, planted it in soil that would transform everything French into something new. But order on paper and order in reality rarely match, especially here. The streets flooded regularly, turned to thick mud that swallowed cartwheels. The wooden buildings rotted in the humidity. The riverbank eroded and had to be constantly reinforced. Everything required more labor than anyone had anticipated, more resources, more human effort. And that human effort came primarily from enslaved Africans. This truth sits at the foundation of New Orleans. Quite literally, the backbreaking work of clearing land, of building levees, of constructing the first buildings, of creating infrastructure where none existed. This work was done by people who had been stolen from their homes, transported across the ocean in conditions of unimaginable cruelty, and forced to build a city in a swamp. They came from Senegambia, from the beat of Benin, from Congo and Angola, bringing with them knowledge and skills that proved essential, knowledge of rice cultivation, of building in tropical climates, of working in wetlands. The French needed this knowledge even as they refused to acknowledge its value, refused to see the people who possessed it as fully human. By 1727, just 9 years after the city's founding, New Orleans held about 1,000 people, and nearly half were enslaved. This ratio would shift over time, but the fundamental reality would remain. The city's prosperity, its very existence, depended on forced labor. The Code Noir, the Black Code, established in 1724, attempted to regulate the institution of slavery, mandating certain treatments, certain protections. But like most legal codes, the gap between what was written and what was practiced could be vast. The Code Noir also required the baptism of enslaved people into Catholicism, creating a religious landscape distinct from the Protestant colonies to the north, planting seeds that would grow into something uniquely New Orleanian. The city grew slowly, haltingly. France had grander ambitions elsewhere, and Louisiana remained something of an afterthought, a drain on resources, a promising idea that never quite delivered the wealth that had been imagined. The fur trade brought some income, as did indigo, but nothing that justified the expense, the lives lost to disease, the constant struggle against nature. And yet people came, French settlers and Canadian voyageurs, German farmers who were settled upriver, soldiers and administrators, nuns and priests, each group adding to the mixture, and enslaved Africans continued to arrive, their presence growing, their cultures beginning to blend and adapt, creating new forms of music, new approaches to cooking, new religious practices that merged Catholic saints with African deities. The Spanish took control in 1763, though they did not actually take possession until 1769. The French colonists resented the change. Some resisted, but Spain had its own ideas about empire, its own approaches to governance, and gradually the Spanish influence began to layer over the French foundation, creating yet another stratum in the city's developing identity. Spanish law was different from French law, particularly regarding free people of color. Spain had a longer history of manumission, of recognizing gradations of freedom and status. And under Spanish rule, the free black population of New Orleans began to grow. People who had purchased their freedom or been granted it, people who existed in a complicated middle space, neither enslaved nor fully free, neither white nor without rights, creating a three-tiered society unlike anything in the British colonies to the east. Fire transformed the city in 1788 on Good Friday. While many were at church, flames began in the home of a military treasurer on Chartres Street. The wind was strong that day, and the wooden buildings, tinder dry despite the humidity, caught and spread. More than 800 structures burned, nearly the entire city consumed, years of building reduced to ash and charred timbers. They rebuilt, of course, because what else could they do? but this time with more brick and stucco, with tile roofs instead of wood, and the architecture began to shift, Spanish colonial style replacing French colonial, courtyards and covered galleries, buildings that addressed the climate more directly, that understood what the heat and rain demanded. Another fire came in 1794, destroying much of what the first fire had spared, and again they rebuilt, and the city that emerged looked different than the one Bienville had imagined, more Spanish in character now, though French remained the dominant language. French culture, the dominant culture, creating a hybrid that belonged fully to neither empire. The river continued its work, building land at the mouth, shifting channels, flooding when it chose, reminding everyone that this city existed on borrowed ground, existed at the sufferance of forces far greater than human ambition. The levees grew higher, were reinforced, were built and rebuilt, a constant negotiation between water and will. Trade flowed through the port, furs from the north, sugar and indigo from the plantations, timber from the forests, all of it passing through New Orleans on its way to the wider world. And with trade came people, sailors and merchants, traders and adventurers, adding their voices to the growing chorus, adding their stories to the accumulating narrative. Congo Square, known then as Place des Nègres, became a gathering place on Sundays. The one-day enslaved people were permitted rest. Here they gathered to trade, to socialize, to dance and make music, drums and voices, movement and rhythm, practices that echoed Africa but were transforming into something new, something that could only exist here. In this particular place, at this particular intersection of cultures and circumstances, the music that emerged from Congo Square would eventually influence everything, would become foundational to jazz, to the blues, to American music itself. But in these early years, it was simply what it was, a necessary expression, a maintenance of humanity under conditions designed to strip humanity away, a preservation of memory and culture against all attempts at erasure. The city's economy depended on plantation agriculture, and plantation agriculture depended on slavery. This is the uncomfortable truth that cannot be avoided. The wealth that built the grand homes, that funded the churches and theaters, that allowed New Orleans to grow from swamp settlement to significant port, this wealth was extracted from human suffering, from bodies worked to exhaustion in sugar cane fields, from families torn apart, from violence normalized and sanctioned by law. By 1800, on the edge of a new century, New Orleans had survived fire and flood, had passed from French to Spanish hands, had grown from a few hundred souls to several thousand, had established itself as a crucial port, the gateway between the vast interior of North America and the Atlantic world, and it had developed a character unlike any other city on the continent, a blend of European and African and Caribbean influences, a place where languages mixed, where cultures collided and merged, where the rules that governed other places seemed somehow negotiable. The 19th century approached, bringing with it changes no one could fully anticipate, bringing expansion and conflict, bringing new wealth and old cruelties, bringing everything that would make New Orleans simultaneously magnificent and tragic, beautiful and brutal, a city of contradictions that would only deepen with time. 1803 arrived with news that traveled slowly up the river, news that would change everything. Thomas Jefferson had purchased Louisiana from Napoleon, the entire territory. 828,000 square miles for $15 million, a transaction that doubled the size of the United States and transferred New Orleans from European to American control, though the people of the city were not entirely certain what this transfer would mean. The Americans came down the river, came overland, entrepreneurs and land speculators, lawyers and merchants, men who saw opportunity in this port city, this gateway to the interior. They brought with them different ideas about governance, about business, about the proper ordering of society, and they found a city that had no intention of becoming American in the way they understood the term. The Creoles, those of French and Spanish descent who had been born in Louisiana, viewed these newcomers with suspicion, these Kaintoks, as they called them after Kentucky, rough men who spoke no French, who understood nothing of the city's culture, who seemed to respect nothing. The tension between Creole and American would define much of the 19th century, would literally divide the city into separate districts, separate ways of being. Canal Street became the dividing line. Americans settling upriver, building their own commercial district, their own neighborhoods, creating what they called the American sector, while the Creoles remained downtown, in the French Quarter and the areas around it, two cities existing side by side, speaking different languages, attending different churches, living according to different codes, but trade cared nothing for cultural divisions, and the port exploded with activity. Flatboats and keelboats from upriver, ocean-going vessels from Europe and the Caribbean, the levee crowded with cargo, cotton bales stacked like white fortresses, hogsheads of sugar and molasses, barrels of flour and whiskey, all of it buying and selling, loading and unloading, the constant movement of goods that meant wealth, that meant power. Cotton became king. The phrase echoed through the counting houses and the coffee houses, through the exchanges where fortunes were made and lost on fluctuations in price. The invention of the cotton gin had made short-staple cotton profitable, and the Deep South transformed into a cotton empire, all of it funneling through New Orleans, flowing down the Mississippi to be weighed and graded and sold and shipped across the ocean to feed the textile mills of England and New England. And cotton meant slavery, meant the expansion of slavery, meant that the already brutal institution grew more entrenched, more economically essential, more defended by those who profited from it. The domestic slave trade flourished. New Orleans became one of the largest slave markets in the nation. People bought and sold like livestock. Families always separated on the auction block. Human beings reduced to commodities, their value calculated in dollars and cents. The slave markets operated openly. Showrooms on Chartres Street and Baronne Street, places where enslaved people were displayed, examined, their bodies scrutinized by potential buyers. The markets advertised in newspapers, described their inventory in language designed to maximize profit. Young men valued for their strength, young women for their reproductive capacity. Children sold away from parents, husbands from wives, a commerce in human suffering that enriched the city even as it corrupted everything it touched. Some enslaved people resisted, ran away to the swamps where communities of maroons established themselves, hidden settlements in places so remote that pursuers could not find them. Others resisted more subtly, worked slowly, broke tools, found small ways to assert agency in a system designed to allow none, and some purchased their freedom, saved money earned through hiring out, through selling goods at market, through years of careful accumulation, buying themselves and their families out of bondage. The free people of color occupied their complicated position. Some owned property, some owned businesses, some even owned enslaved people themselves. A fact that complicates any simple narrative. They created their own societies, their own social clubs, sent their children to France for education when they could afford it, existed in a space between neither white nor enslaved, with rights that were always conditional, always subject to restriction, always dependent on the tolerance of white society. Yellow fever returned every summer, sweeping through the city in waves, killing thousands. The fever showed no respect for status or wealth, though those who could afford to leave would flee to the Gulf Coast, to Mandeville across Lake Pontchartrain. Anywhere the air seemed cleaner, cooler, less saturated with whatever miasma they believed carried the disease. They did not know about mosquitoes yet, would not know for decades, and so the fever came and came and came, part of the rhythm of the year, as expected as summer heat. The city grew despite the fever, or perhaps because of it, because those who survived developed immunity, became acclimated, became true New Orleanians in a way newcomers were not. Yellow fever sorted the population, determined who would stay and who would flee, who would build lives here, and who would abandon the attempt. Steamboats appeared on the river in 1812, the New Orleans making its maiden voyage from Pittsburgh, announcing a new era. Suddenly travel upriver became possible, practical. Trade could flow both ways with greater ease, and the city's importance as a port magnified. Steamboat traffic increased year by year, decade by decade. The levee crowded with vessels, their smokestacks rising like a forest of iron trees, their paddle wheels churning the brown water. The Battle of New Orleans came in January of 1815. Though the war had already ended, news traveling too slowly to prevent the fight, Andrew Jackson led a ragtag force of regular Army soldiers, Tennessee and Kentucky militia, free men of color, Choctaw warriors, even pirates from Jean Lafitte's Barataria operation. They faced British regulars, professional soldiers who had defeated Napoleon, and somehow in the cypress swamps below the city. Jackson's forces won decisively, killed or wounded more than 2,000 British while losing fewer than 100 of their own. The victory became legend, became foundational to New Orleans mythology, proof that this city could defend itself, could unite disparate groups in common cause, though the unity proved temporary, and the contributions of free black soldiers would be conveniently forgotten when it suited the white establishment to forget them. The city's population swelled. 10,000 in 1810 became 46,000 by 1840, became over 160,000 by 1860. Immigrants arrived from Ireland and Germany, fled famine and political upheaval in Europe, found work on the docks, in the warehouses, built their own neighborhoods, added their own traditions to the accumulating mix. Irish laborers dug the New Basin Canal, thousands dying in the effort, buried in the swampy ground they had been excavating, their sacrifice barely noted, certainly not memorialized. The French Opera House opened in 1859, grand and ornate, a statement that New Orleans was not just a commercial city, but a cultural one. Opera in French, balls and social events that rivaled anything in Paris, or so the Creoles liked to believe. The Americans built their own theaters, their own hotels. St. Charles Hotel, rising enormous and impressive, designed to dwarf anything in the French Quarter, architecture as competition, as statement of intent. Mardi Gras evolved from informal street celebrations into something more organized. The first crew, Comus, parading in 1857, establishing traditions that would continue, elaborate floats and costume, masked balls, a season of celebration before the austerity of Lent, but also a reinforcement of social hierarchies. Crews organized by class and race, exclusivity embedded in the revelry. The restaurants and cafes multiplied. Antoine's opening in 1840, bringing French cuisine, adapting it to local ingredients, creating dishes that existed nowhere else. Pompano en papillote, oysters, Rockefeller, the marriage of French technique and Louisiana abundance. The coffee houses served café au lait and beignets. Chicory stretched the coffee, made it last, gave it a particular bitterness that became associated with New Orleans, with mornings in the French Quarter, with the way the city tasted. Music filled the streets, always had, but now it began to formalize, to professionalize. Brass bands played for parades and funerals, second lines following behind, dancing and celebrating even in mourning, especially in mourning, because death was so common here, so present, that it demanded acknowledgement, demanded that life be celebrated even as, perhaps especially as, it ended. The sounds mixed, African rhythms and European harmony, spirituals and opera, work songs and waltzes, all of it blending in ways that defied categorization, in ways that could only happen here, where boundaries between cultures were more porous than elsewhere, where necessity and proximity forced interaction, forced synthesis, but beneath all the culture, all the celebration, all the commerce and growth, the fundamental contradiction remained. This was a city built on slavery, dependent on slavery, enriched by slavery, and as the 1850s progressed, as the national conflict over slavery intensified, New Orleans found itself positioned precariously, economically tied to the Deep South, to cotton and sugar, but also connected to the wider world, dependent on northern merchants, on international trade, on systems that transcended regional loyalty. The city's Jewish community grew. Sephardic Jews from the Caribbean, German Jews fleeing Europe, establishing themselves as merchants, contributing to the commercial life, building synagogues, adding another thread to the cultural tapestry, another set of traditions, another way of understanding the divine. Congo Square continued its Sunday gatherings, though authorities periodically attempted to restrict them, worried about what such gatherings might mean, what organization might emerge, what resistance might be planned. But the gatherings persisted, evolved, became known beyond the city, became something tourists came to observe, to marvel at, to misunderstand. The decade of the 1850s represented a peak, the city's population at its highest, the port processing more cargo than ever before, culture flourishing, wealth accumulating, but also the last moment before everything changed, before the contradiction at the city's heart could no longer be sustained, before the nation tore itself apart, and New Orleans, positioned as it was, suffered the consequences. 1861 arrived with secession, Louisiana leaving the Union in January, joining the Confederacy, casting its lot with the slave-holding South. The decision seemed inevitable to many, but it carried consequences that few fully anticipated, consequences that would reshape the city, would end one era and begin another. The war came quickly to New Orleans, Union forces recognizing the strategic importance of the port. Controlling the Mississippi meant controlling the Confederacy's lifeline, meant cutting the South in two. And so in April of 1862, just over a year into the war, Admiral David Farragut's fleet pushed past the fort's downriver, sailed up to the city, and demanded surrender. The city had no choice, no real defenses against naval bombardment, and so it yielded, became occupied territory. Union soldiers marching through streets that had celebrated secession just months before, General Benjamin Butler taking command, imposing martial law, confiscating property, hanging William Mumford for tearing down the American flag, ruling with an iron hand that earned him the nickname Beast Butler and the lasting hatred of white New Orleans. The occupation transformed everything. Suddenly the rules changed. Enslaved people fled to Union lines, claimed freedom. The Confiscation Acts declared them contraband of war, property to be seized from rebels, though this designation dehumanized even as it liberated. Thousands sought refuge with Union forces, creating camps, creating chaos, creating new realities that no one had planned for. Butler employed formerly enslaved people, put them to work improving the city's infrastructure, cleaning the streets, draining standing water, and whether by design or accident, New Orleans experienced its first summer in decades without a major yellow fever outbreak. The correlation went largely unnoticed, but the fever's absence spoke to what proper sanitation could accomplish. The free people of color organized, formed military units, the Native Guards. Among the first black soldiers officially mustered into Union service, they had initially offered their services to the Confederacy, been rejected. Now they fought for the Union, for freedom, though they faced discrimination even from those they fought alongside, restricted to black regiments, commanded initially by white officers. Their service tolerated more than celebrated. The war dragged on, and New Orleans sat occupied, cut off from the cotton trade that had been its lifeblood. The port still functioned, but diminished, trade restricted, wealth evaporating. The grand homes began to show signs of neglect, paint peeling, gardens overgrown, fortunes made in cotton and sugar dissolved as the plantation economy collapsed. Lee surrendered in April of 1865. The war ended, but what came next proved in some ways more difficult than the war itself. Reconstruction arrived with promises and problems, with hope and violence, with the possibility of genuine change and the fierce resistance to any such change. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship. The 15th promised voting rights. And for a brief moment, a handful of years, it seemed that New Orleans might become something different, might live up to ideals it had never embodied. Black men voted, held office, sat in the legislature, participated in governance in ways that had been unthinkable just years before. But white New Orleans, particularly the Creole elite and the rising class of white supremacists, had no intention of accepting this new order. They organized, formed groups with innocuous names that masked violent intent, the White League most prominent among them, dedicated to restoring white rule, to returning black citizens to subservience, to ensuring that freedom remained as limited as possible. The Battle of Liberty Place erupted in September of 1874. Not really a battle so much as an insurrection, the White League attacking the integrated Metropolitan Police and state militia, seizing control of the city for 3 days before federal forces restored order. The violence was a statement, a demonstration that white New Orleans would fight, would kill, to prevent racial equality. P.B.S. Pinchback became governor. Briefly, the first black governor of any state, his tenure lasting just weeks, but representing possibility, representing what might have been if Reconstruction had been supported, if the federal government had maintained commitment, if the opposition had not been so fierce, so willing to use violence. But Reconstruction was always fragile, always contested. And when federal troops withdrew in 1877, when the compromise of that year ended military occupation, white Democrats moved quickly to reclaim total control, to disenfranchise black voters through poll taxes and literacy tests, through violence and intimidation, to create a system of segregation that would last nearly a century. The city rebuilt slowly. Cotton trade resumed, though never at antebellum levels. New industries emerged: sugar refining, coffee importing, fruit from Central America arriving through the port. But the economy struggled. The grand wealth of the 1850s never quite returned. The city settled into a different role, still important, but no longer dominant, still vital, but diminished. Yellow fever returned in 1878, the worst outbreak yet, killing more than 4,000 in New Orleans alone, more than 20,000 across the South, the disease sweeping through neighborhoods, overwhelming hospitals, filling cemeteries. People fled if they could. Those who remained barricaded themselves, burned tar in the streets, tried every remedy anyone could imagine, and nothing worked. The fever took who it took and left the survivors traumatized, desperate for answers. The Cotton Centennial Exposition opened in 1884, an attempt to announce the city's revival, to attract investment, to demonstrate that New Orleans had recovered from war and disease. The exposition sprawled across 249 acres in Audubon Park, featured exhibits from around the world, attracted more than 1 million visitors, and lost money, ended in financial failure, though it did bring the world's attention back to the city, did suggest that New Orleans still mattered. Jim Crow laws formalized segregation, separate schools, separate streetcars, separate everything. The color line hardened into legal mandate, enforced by law and by custom, by violence when necessary. The system ensured that the freed people would remain as restricted as possible, that economic opportunity would be limited, that political power would be denied, that the racial hierarchy of slavery would persist in modified form. And yet, within these restrictions, within this oppression, Black New Orleans created, innovated, built institutions and culture, established churches that became centers of community, founded schools, created mutual aid societies, maintained traditions, and made the music that would eventually transform American culture, though that transformation still lay ahead, still waited in the future. Storyville emerged in 1897, a designated district for legalized prostitution, an attempt to contain vice, to regulate what could not be eliminated, And in the saloons and dance halls of Storyville, in the bordellos and gambling houses, musicians played, pianists developing a style that would be called jazz, though the word had not yet been applied. The music existed first. The name came later. The music drew from everything, from the blues that had emerged from the cotton fields, from the brass band traditions of street parades, from ragtime and spirituals, from African rhythms and European harmony, from the particular mixing that happened only in New Orleans, only in a place where cultures had been colliding and blending for 2 centuries, where the boundaries had always been more porous than the laws suggested. Buddy Bolden played cornet, loud and powerful, developing a style that emphasized improvisation, personal expression. King Oliver followed, and Louis Armstrong, though Armstrong was still a child in these years, still growing up in the neighborhood called Storyville, listening to the music that would shape his life, that he would carry out of New Orleans and into the world. The new century arrived, 1900 marking a transition, the city's population nearing 300,000, infrastructure improving slowly, drainage projects attempting to manage the water that had always threatened, attempting to expand the city into areas that had been too wet, too low, too impossible, but possibility was relative in New Orleans. Impossibility had never stopped anything before. The port modernized, shifted from sailing vessels to steamships, adapted to new technologies, new methods of cargo handling, remained a crucial gateway even as other cities grew larger, even as the nation's center of gravity shifted westward. New Orleans endured, persisted, maintained its particular character even as the world changed around it. Mardi Gras continued, grew more elaborate, more commercial. Tourists began coming specifically for carnival season. Hotels filled, restaurants prospered. The celebration became an economic engine, a draw for visitors who wanted to experience something they could find nowhere else. The crews multiplied, Rex and Proteus and dozens more, each with their own traditions, their own exclusions, their own place in the social hierarchy. The city aged into the 20th century carrying its history like sediment, like layers of accumulated meaning that shaped everything. The architecture spoke of French and Spanish roots even as American progress marched forward. The language held onto French phrases, French names, even as English dominated. The food maintained its distinctiveness, its fusion of influences that belonged to no single tradition, and always the river flowed, constant and changing, building land at the mouth, threatening floods, bringing commerce and connection. The Mississippi remained what it had always been, the reason for the city's existence, the source of its prosperity and its peril, the great brown highway that linked New Orleans to half a continent, that made this improbable place possible, necessary, inevitable. The water defined everything, shaped the geography, determined where people could build and where they could not, influenced the culture, the food, the very rhythm of life. New Orleans existed because of water and despite water, embraced by the river, threatened by the lake and the Gulf, a city that had always been negotiating, always been balancing, always been existing in that precarious space between land and sea, between what was possible and what should never have been attempted. The question arises, not loudly, but quietly, in the space between what was and what became. How does a place hold so much contradiction? How does beauty emerge from brutality? How does culture flourish in soil poisoned by injustice? New Orleans offers no simple answers, perhaps offers no answers at all, only the reality of what happened, what continues to happen. The layering of experience upon experience, each generation adding to what came before, unable to escape the weight of history, unwilling to abandon the richness it provides. The music carries memory, notes holding stories that words cannot contain, a trumpet line remembering Africa, a piano chord echoing France, a rhythm that belongs only to this corner of the world, this bend in the river where everything mixed and nothing remained pure, where purity was never the point, where survival demanded adaptation, demanded creativity, demanded making something new from whatever materials were at hand. In the cemeteries, the dead rest above ground, necessity creating architecture, the water table too high for traditional burial, and so the cities of the dead rise. Whitewashed tombs like small houses, like miniature cities mirroring the city of the living, families entombed together, names stacked on marble, generations sharing space, the dead as present as the living, never quite gone, never quite separate. The oak trees stand witness, live oaks that were already ancient when the French arrived, their branches spreading horizontal, draped with Spanish moss that is neither Spanish nor moss, but an air plant, an epiphyte, taking nothing from its host, merely using the tree as platform, as anchor, the way New Orleans used the river, the way everything here uses everything else. Symbiosis and exploitation tangled together until distinguishing between them becomes impossible. The city taught lessons to those willing to learn, taught that order is temporary, that control is illusion, that the best we can do is negotiate with forces larger than ourselves. The river taught this. The fever taught this. The storms that swept in from the Gulf taught this. And the people, especially those who had been enslaved, who had survived the unsurvivable, they knew this already, knew that life meant adaptation, meant finding joy where joy could be found, meant celebrating even when, especially when, circumstances suggested despair. The food tells its own story. Gumbo, with its African okra and French roux and Native American filet, jambalaya echoing Spanish paella, but transformed by Louisiana ingredients, by Creole innovation, red beans and rice, the Monday meal using the weekend's ham bone, practicality, becoming tradition, becoming identity, each dish a historical document, each recipe a record of who came here, what they brought, how they survived. The wrought iron balconies trace patterns against the sky, geometric and floral, functional and decorative, cast in foundries that no longer exist, installed by craftsmen whose names were never recorded. And the patterns repeat, echo, create shadows that move with the sun, creating beauty as byproduct, as afterthought, as if beauty here cannot help but emerge, cannot help but assert itself even in the simplest structures. The language persists, French phrases embedded in English sentences, making groceries instead of buying them, neutral ground for the median, where you at as greeting, words that mark belonging, that separate native from newcomer, that carry centuries of usage, of meaning layered upon meaning, of subtle distinctions that only locals recognize. And through it all, through centuries, through war and disease and flood, through occupation and reconstruction and segregation, through everything that should have destroyed it, the city endured, not unchanged, never unchanged, but recognizable, essentially itself, maintaining something that defied easy categorization, that belonged to no single tradition but drew from all of them. The river kept flowing, seasons changed, summer heat gave way to winter rain, gave way to spring humidity, gave way to summer heat again, the cycle endless, predictable, and within that cycle the city lived, celebrated, mourned, created, destroyed, rebuilt, always rebuilding, always starting over, always incorporating disaster into the ongoing story. Perhaps this is what New Orleans teaches finally, that history is not past, is not distant, is not something to be studied from safe remove. History here presses close, breathes down the neck, shapes the present moment in ways both visible and invisible. The streets follow patterns laid out 300 years ago. The culture draws from sources that predate the city. The conflicts that defined the 19th century echo in the 21st. To walk through the French Quarter is to walk through time, not literally, not in any mystical sense, but simply because the past here is not buried, is not hidden, is built into the architecture, embedded in the very ground, present in ways that newer cities without this weight of history cannot match. The city holds its contradictions without resolving them, holds beauty and brutality in the same hand, holds celebration and suffering in the same heart. And perhaps this is honest. Perhaps this reflects reality more accurately than places that pretend their histories are simpler, their foundations more pure. New Orleans built on impossible ground, survived impossible odds, created impossible culture, and always finds a way to persist, to adapt, to transform disaster into opportunity, to make something beautiful from whatever materials circumstance provides. The light changes now, moving toward that golden hour when the sun slants low, when shadows grow long across Jackson Square, when the cathedral bells mark time as they have marked time for centuries, their sound carrying across the river, across the neighborhoods, a sound that means evening, that means the day turning towards night. Somewhere a street musician plays, notes drifting through the warm air, disappearing into the leaves of the banana trees, dissolving into the general sound of the city, traffic and voices and the constant low hum of existence, of life continuing, of stories being written even now, even in this moment. The Mississippi flows as it has always flowed, as it will continue to flow long after all our stories have been forgotten. The water brown with sediment, carrying soil from Minnesota and Montana, from the Dakotas and Iowa, from half the continent, depositing it here at the Delta, building land grain by grain, the opposite of erosion, creation instead of destruction, though both happen simultaneously, always both. In the courtyards the fountains trickle, water over stone, the sound echoing off brick walls, mixing with the rustle of palm fronds, the whisper of wind through the magnolia leaves, sounds that have been here as long as the city, sounds that will remain, that belong to this place in ways that transcend human occupation. The stories accumulate like sediment, like the soil the river deposits, layer upon layer, each generation adding its experiences, its interpretations, its understanding of what this place means, what it has meant, what it might become, and the layers compress, become foundation, become the ground on which new stories build. The street names still carry their histories, Esplanade and Rampart, Chupitulas and Pontchartrain, French and Spanish and Native American, languages side by side on the map, reminders that this was never one thing, was always multiple, always mixed, always refusing simple categories. And as evening deepens, as the light fades from gold to amber to violet, the city settles into its rhythms, the restaurants fill, music spills from doorways, people gather on porches and balconies, continuing conversations that started generations ago, conversations about who we are, about where we come from, about how we make sense of inheritance, both glorious and terrible. The river reflects the fading sky, holds the colors for a moment before darkness comes, and the darkness, when it comes, is not empty, is filled with sound and scent, with the perfume of jasmine and the must of the river, with music and laughter and the eternal presence of water, of moisture in the air, of the gulf waiting just beyond sight. New Orleans rests, though it never fully sleeps. The city that proved impossible was possible, that demonstrated survival against all reasonable odds, that created culture from collision, beauty from struggle, joy from sorrow, that remains, that endures, that continues its conversation with the river, with the past, with all the futures that might yet unfold. The story goes on, always goes on, but our telling of it must end, must fade like the light fades, like music fades when the player stops, like all things fade eventually, leaving only echoes, only memories, only the sense that something significant happened here, continues to happen here, will happen here long after these words have dissolved into silence. The river flows, the city breathes, and the night comes gently, comes like a blanket, comes like sleep, comes like the end of a very long story, a story that is also a beginning, also a continuation, also a promise that tomorrow the river will still be flowing, the city will still be standing, and the stories, the endless accumulating stories, will still be waiting to be told. There is a quietness that settles over certain thoughts, a particular kind of stillness that comes when considering the hidden architecture of everything around us. And tonight, I find myself drawn into that contemplative space where the invisible becomes almost tangible, where the building blocks of existence reveal themselves not through noise or spectacle, but through patient observation and gentle wonder. Chemistry is everywhere, in the air moving through an open window, in the pages of an old book, in the glass that holds water, in the water itself, and yet it remains largely unseen, working its quiet transformations beneath the surface of our daily awareness. It is the language that matter uses to speak to itself, the grammar of atoms and molecules, the syntax of bonds forming and breaking in an endless, elegant conversation. I imagine a laboratory late in the evening, not the bright, bustling space of daytime work, but rather a place where shadows lengthen across wooden benches, where glass vessels catch the last amber light, where everything has settled into a profound hush. In such a space, one might sense the presence of something ancient and fundamental, the same forces that have been orchestrating the dance of particles since the universe began, still present, still active, still weaving their intricate patterns. The periodic table hangs on a wall somewhere in my mind's eye. That elegant arrangement of elements, each one a distinct character in the grand story of matter. Hydrogen, the simplest, the first, born in the heart of the universe itself. Carbon, the backbone of the life, the connector, the builder of infinite complexity. Oxygen, the breath, the burner, the partner in so many essential reactions. These are not mere abstractions, not just symbols in boxes arranged in rows. They are the fundamental vocabulary of existence, the letters from which every material thing is written. The iron in ancient meteorites and the iron in our blood share the same essential nature. The carbon in a diamond and the carbon in a pencil lead differ only in arrangement, in the pattern of their connections, in the geometry of their bonds. There is something deeply calming about this realization that beneath all the variety and complexity of the material world, beneath the countless forms and textures and colors, there exists a finite collection of elemental building blocks, 94 of them occurring naturally, each with its own character, its own way of interacting with others. And from this relatively small alphabet, the universe composes everything we see and touch and experience. Tonight, I find myself drawn into this realm not as a student facing an examination, not as someone seeking to master formulas or memorize reactions, but rather as someone standing at the edge of a vast, quiet ocean, content to observe the patterns in the waves, to notice how water moves, how light plays across its surface, how everything connects in subtle, beautiful ways. The story of chemistry is really the story of transformation, of how one thing becomes another through the rearrangement of atoms. It is the story of fire turning wood to ash and heat and light, of iron slowly joining with oxygen to form rust, of grapes fermenting into wine, of flour and water and yeast rising into bread. These transformations have accompanied humanity since our earliest days, and long before anyone understood the underlying mechanisms, people observed, experimented, and learned to work with these mysterious changes. There is an old alchemical symbol, a snake eating its own tail, representing cycles and transformation and the unity of all matter. The alchemists, those medieval and Renaissance seekers, were wrong about many things. They never succeeded in turning lead into gold, never found the universal elixir, and yet they were not entirely misguided. They understood intuitively that matter could be transformed, that hidden relationships existed between different substances, that patient observation and careful experiment could reveal profound truths. In many ways, they were the ancestors of modern chemistry, their smoky laboratories and cryptic manuscripts forming a bridge between ancient philosophy and systematic science. They developed techniques for distillation, for separation, for purification. They created specialized vessels and tools. They kept meticulous records, even if those records were sometimes obscured by mystical language and symbolic imagery. And underneath all their spiritual seeking and their quest for transmutation, they were engaging with something real and profound, the actual behavior of matter, the genuine transformations that occur when substances combine or separate, when heat is applied or removed, when solutions crystallize or vapors condense. I can almost smell the strange mixture of aromas that must have filled those old laboratories, the sulfurous tang, the sharp bite of acids, the sweet, heavy scent of certain metals, the acrid smoke of burning materials, each smell a clue, each observation a piece of a larger puzzle, slowly, over centuries, being assembled into something approaching understanding. But even now, even with our modern knowledge and sophisticated instruments, there remains something mysterious and wonderful about chemistry, something that invites quiet contemplation rather than mere memorization. It asks us to imagine scales we cannot directly perceive, to think about particles too small to see, about reactions happening in infinitesimal fractions of a second, about forces that hold atoms together with invisible yet powerful bonds. And so tonight, I invite myself deeper into this realm, not rushing, not straining, but allowing the story to unfold at its own pace, like a chemical reaction proceeding according to its own inherent timing, like a crystal slowly growing in a saturated solution, adding layer upon layer, building structure from solution, creating order from apparent chaos. The story begins long before there were laboratories or textbooks, long before anyone had conceived of atoms or elements in the way we understand them now. It begins with fire, with that first flame captured and tended, with humanity's earliest encounter with deliberate transformation. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of years ago, a group of people gathered around a fire, watching as wood, solid and substantial, becomes heat and light and smoke and a small pile of ash. The wood is gone, transformed into something else entirely. This must have seemed like magic, like a doorway into forces beyond ordinary comprehension, and in a sense, it was. Fire became humanity's first chemical laboratory. In its heat, clay hardened into pottery, giving people vessels to store and carry and cook. Certain rocks, when subjected to intense heat, yielded metals, copper first, gleaming and malleable, then bronze when copper was combined with tin, opening an entire era of human development. The people who discovered these processes didn't understand oxidation or reduction, didn't know about the rearrangement of atomic bonds, but they learned through patient trial and observation. They learned which ores yielded which metals, which temperatures were needed, which techniques produced the best results. This was chemistry, practical and empirical, passed down through generations as closely guarded knowledge. In the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians developed sophisticated chemical practices. They created pigments of stunning permanence, blues and greens and golds that still shine on tomb walls thousands of years later. They developed techniques for extracting and purifying metals, for making glass, for creating cosmetics and medicines, for the elaborate process of mummification. The word chemistry itself, some scholars believe, derives from the ancient Egyptian word for their land, chem or kemet, meaning black earth, the dark fertile soil left by the Nile's flooding. This connection feels appropriate, chemistry emerging from the earth, from the transformation of materials, from the patient work of hands, learning to shape and change the substances of the world. The Egyptians created natron, a mixture of sodium compounds, which they used in mummification and in glass making. They made faience, that brilliant blue-green glazed ceramic. They extracted oils and essences through primitive distillation. They ground minerals into powders, mixed compounds, observed reactions, all without understanding the underlying principles, yet achieving remarkable results through careful attention and accumulated experience. Meanwhile, in different parts of the world, other civilizations were conducting their own chemical explorations. In China, Artisans were creating porcelain of extraordinary refinement, the right clay, the right temperature, the right glaze, all had to come together in precise harmony. They were also experimenting with what would eventually become gunpowder, mixing sulfur and charcoal and saltpeter, observing the dramatic reactions when these substances combined. The Chinese developed intricate processes for extracting metals from ores. They created bronze vessels of incredible artistry and technical sophistication. They fermented grains into alcohol, pickled vegetables, made vinegar. All of these processes involved chemical transformations, though the language to describe them would not exist for many centuries. In the ancient Mediterranean world, Greek philosophers began to ask fundamental questions about the nature of matter. What is everything made of? They wondered. What underlying substance or substances compose the vast variety of things we observe? Thales of Miletus, living around 600 years before the Common Era, proposed that water was the fundamental substance, the origin of all things. This seems quaint now, but it represented a crucial shift in thinking, an attempt to find unity beneath diversity, to identify fundamental principles rather than simply cataloging observations. Empedocles proposed that 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, combined in different proportions to create everything in the material world. These elements were thought to be moved by 2 forces, love, which brought them together, and strife, which drove them apart. It's a poetic framework mixing physics and metaphysics, but it represented an attempt to understand transformation and change. Democritus, whose name means chosen of the people, proposed something remarkably prescient. He suggested that if you kept dividing matter, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces, you would eventually reach a point where no further division was possible. These ultimate particles he called atomos, meaning indivisible. He imagined these atoms as tiny, solid, eternal particles, differing in shape and size, and that the properties of different materials arose from the shapes and arrangements of their component atoms. This was an extraordinary insight, arrived at through pure reasoning rather than experiment. Democritus couldn't see atoms, couldn't prove their existence, but his intuition led him toward a truth that wouldn't be confirmed for more than 2,000 years. His contemporaries largely ignored or rejected his ideas, preferring the more elaborate and explanatory frameworks of other philosophers, and yet his vision of atoms moving through void, combining and separating, contained the seed of modern atomic theory. Aristotle, perhaps the most influential of ancient philosophers, modified and extended the 4-element theory, adding a 5th element, the quintessence or ether, thought to compose the heavenly bodies. He proposed that substances could transform from one to another through changes in their qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry, lead and gold. In this view were different combinations of the same fundamental matter, suggesting that transformation between them might be possible. This Aristotelian framework would dominate Western thought about matter for nearly 2,000 years. It was elegant, comprehensive, and completely wrong in most of its specifics, and yet it served as a foundation for countless investigations and experiments. It gave people a language to discuss material change, a framework within which to organize observations. The practical arts continued to advance throughout the classical period and into the medieval era. Metallurgists refined their techniques, learning to work with iron, to create steel, to alloy different metals for different purposes. Glassmakers achieved new levels of clarity and color. Dyers discovered new ways to extract and fix colors from plants and minerals and certain sea creatures. The production of Tyrian purple, that royal color extracted from thousands of sea snails, represented both chemistry and economics. The process was complex, labor-intensive, and the result was a dye of exceptional quality and permanence. The exact mechanisms of how the chemical compounds in the snail's secretions bonded with fabric fibers was unknown, but the process worked, and that was sufficient. Fermentation remained mysterious and almost magical. Bread rising, grapes becoming wine, honey becoming mead, milk becoming cheese. These transformations happened in their own time, seemingly of their own accord, guided by invisible agents that wouldn't be identified as microorganisms for many more centuries. People developed elaborate rituals and precise methods, knowing that certain conditions favored successful fermentation while others led to spoilage. In the medieval Islamic world, chemistry advanced significantly through the work of scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latin as Geber, working in the 8th and 9th centuries. He emphasized careful experimentation and detailed observation. He described processes like distillation and sublimation with precision. He worked with various chemical substances, acids and alkalis, salts and metals. Jabir wrote extensively, though many works attributed to him may have been written by later scholars using his name. His texts described laboratory equipment and techniques, methods for purifying substances, procedures for combining materials. Much of his work was wrapped in symbolic and mystical language, following the tradition of keeping chemical knowledge hidden from the uninitiated. But beneath the symbolism lay genuine experimental work and practical knowledge. The development of distillation technology represented a major advance. The alembic, a specially designed vessel for separating substances by heating and condensing, allowed for the purification of liquids, the concentration of essences, the separation of alcohol from fermented beverages. In skilled hands, distillation could isolate specific components from complex mixtures, producing substances of unprecedented purity. Arabic scholars preserved and translated ancient Greek texts on natural philosophy, adding their own observations and innovations. They coined new terms, many of which have passed into modern chemistry: alcohol, alkali, elixir, alembic, all derived from Arabic. This linguistic legacy reflects the central role that Islamic scholars played in developing chemical knowledge during Europe's medieval period. The quest for the philosopher's stone became a central preoccupation of medieval and Renaissance alchemy. This legendary substance was imagined to have the power to transform base metals into gold, to create an elixir of life, to perfect matter itself. The search for it drove countless experiments, motivated scholars to spend years in their laboratories, mixing, heating, observing, recording. Was this search misguided? Perhaps. Gold cannot be made from lead through chemical means. Atoms of one element cannot be transformed into atoms of another element through the processes available to alchemists. And yet, the search itself generated real knowledge. Alchemists developed new kopke equipment and techniques. They discovered new substances and documented their properties. They learned about acids and bases, about crystallization and precipitation, about the behavior of materials under different conditions. Paracelsus, working in the early 16th century, challenged many traditional alchemical and medical ideas. He emphasized the importance of chemistry for medicine, proposing that the body functioned through chemical processes and that diseases should be treated with chemical remedies rather than the traditional herbal preparations. He introduced the use of specific minerals and chemical compounds as medicines, mercury and antimony and sulfur compounds. His ideas were controversial and often overstated, but he helped shift alchemy toward a more medical and practical orientation. He insisted on the importance of experiment over authority, declaring that knowledge came from observation and testing rather than from ancient texts. This empirical emphasis, combined with his focus on practical applications, helped lay groundwork for chemistry's emergence as a distinct discipline. The alchemists worked in spaces filled with furnaces and vessels, retorts and crucibles. Their laboratories must have been extraordinary places, filled with strange smells and colored smokes, with substances bubbling and crystallizing, with the constant work of heating and cooling, mixing and separating. The knowledge they accumulated was often recorded in coded language and allegorical imagery, making it difficult for outsiders to understand. Yet within the alchemical community, this symbolic language conveyed real information about procedures and substances. Gradually, through the 17th century, a transformation began to occur in how people approached the study of matter. The mystical and symbolic framework of alchemy started to give way to something more systematic, more openly shared, more focused on understanding rather than simply achieving practical results. Robert Boyle, working in England and Ireland in the 1600s, embodied the shift. He conducted careful experiments with gases, with combustion, with the properties of air. He developed an improved air pump, allowing him to create partial vacuums and observe how substances behaved in the absence of air. He found that a flame would not burn without air, that animals could not survive without air, that sound did not travel in a vacuum. Boyle published his findings openly, writing in clear language rather than alchemical codes. He emphasized reproducibility, the idea that experiments should be described clearly enough that others could repeat them and verify the results. This seems obvious now, but it represented a profound change in how knowledge about matter was shared and validated. He questioned the Aristotelian four elements, arguing instead that elements should be defined as the simplest substances into which matter could be divided, substances that could not be broken down further. This was a crucial conceptual shift, moving away from philosophical speculation toward operational definitions based on experiment. In his book, The Skeptical Chymist, published in 1661, Boyle challenged both the four-element theory of the ancient Greeks and the three-principle theory popular among alchemists: sulfur, mercury, and salt. He argued for a more empirical approach, observing what actually happened when substances were heated or mixed or separated, rather than imposing preconceived frameworks. The air itself became an object of intense investigation. What was this invisible substance that surrounded everything, that was essential for fire and for life? Different investigators began to realize that air was not a single pure element, but rather a mixture of different substances. Joseph Black, working in Scotland in the 1700s, investigated what he called fixed air, what we now know as carbon dioxide. He showed that this gas was produced when certain carbonates were heated, and that it was the same gas produced by respiration and by burning. He demonstrated that it was denser than ordinary air, that it extinguished flames, that it could be absorbed by alkaline solutions. Black's work was meticulous. He weighed substances before and after chemical reactions, measuring the changes with precision. This quantitative approach, applying careful measurement to chemical processes, would become increasingly important, transforming chemistry from a primarily qualitative science into one based on exact measurements and mathematical relationships. Joseph Priestley, an English clergyman and natural philosopher, conducted extensive experiments with different kinds of air, or gases as they would come to be called. He isolated and studied what he called dephlogisticated air, a gas in which flames burned brighter and mice lived longer. This was oxygen, though Priestley himself never fully abandoned the phlogiston theory to understand its true nature. The phlogiston theory held that combustible materials contained a substance called phlogiston that was released during burning. When something burned completely, it had released all its phlogiston. This theory explained many observations why metals gained weight when they burned. They were supposedly losing light phlogiston and retaining heavy residue, but it ultimately proved to be wrong. An elegant idea that didn't match reality. In France, Antoine Lavoisier was conducting his own careful experiments, weighing substances before and after reactions with unprecedented precision. He heated mercury in a closed container, carefully measuring the air and the mercury and the red powder that formed. He noticed that when mercury was heated, it combined with part of the air, and the remaining air would not support combustion or life. When he collected the red powder and heated it more intensely, the mercury returned, and the gas released was the same as Priestley's dephlogisticated air. Lavoisier realized that combustion was not about releasing phlogiston, but about combining with this component of air. He named it oxygen, from Greek words meaning acid former, because he believed it was essential for forming acids. Lavoisier's work in the 1780s and 90s established the law of conservation of mass. The principle that in chemical reactions matter is neither created nor destroyed, but only transformed. Total mass before a reaction equals total mass after. This seems simple, but it was revolutionary, providing a foundation for understanding chemical change through careful measurement and balance. He developed a new system for naming chemical compounds, working with other French chemists to create a logical nomenclature based on the elements that composed each substance. This system replaced the confused multitude of traditional names: oil of vitriol and butter of antimony and lunar caustic, with names that indicated composition: sulfuric acid and antimony, chloride, and silver nitrate. This new language made chemistry more accessible, more logical. It allowed chemists to communicate precisely about substances and reactions, to see patterns and relationships that had been obscured by traditional naming. It represented chemistry becoming a true science with systematic methods and clear terminology. Lavoisier also compiled a list of elements, substances that could not be decomposed by any known means. His list included true elements like oxygen and nitrogen and hydrogen, but also some substances that would later be found to be compounds. His approach was sound, even if his list was imperfect. Elements were defined operationally by what they were observed to be, not by philosophical preconceptions. Tragically, Lavoisier was guillotined during the French Revolution in 1794, a victim of political upheaval. His contributions to chemistry were deemed irrelevant by revolutionary tribunals, focused on his former role as a tax collector. A colleague reportedly said that it took only a moment to cut off his head. But France might not produce another like it in a century. The loss was profound, a brilliant mind silenced at the height of his productivity. Yet his work survived him. The new chemistry he had helped establish continued to develop. Other investigators built on his foundations, exploring the properties of elements, studying how they combined, measuring the proportions in which substances reacted. John Dalton, an English schoolteacher with a deep curiosity about the natural world, proposed in the early 1800s that each element consisted of identical atoms with a specific weight, and that compounds formed when atoms of different elements combined in definite, simple ratios, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. This atomic theory revived and refined the ancient ideas of Democritus, but now grounded them in experimental observation and measurement. Dalton assigned relative weights to the atoms of different elements, using hydrogen as the standard with a weight of 1. His values weren't always accurate, but the principle was sound. Each element had atoms of characteristic mass, and these masses determined the proportions in which elements combined. He explained why a given compound always had the same composition, why water was always 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen by volume, why carbon dioxide was always carbon combined with oxygen in a specific ratio, because compounds were formed by atoms combining in definite whole number proportions. Dalton was colorblind, which he investigated scientifically, writing the first detailed description of the condition. He was quiet, methodical, keeping detailed weather records every day for more than 50 years. He approached chemistry with the same patient observational spirit, accumulating data, looking for pattern, building theory from careful measurement. As the 19th century progressed, more elements were discovered and isolated. Humphrey Davy in England used electricity to decompose compounds, isolating sodium and potassium by passing electric current through molten salts. These reactive metals had never been seen in pure form before. Sodium, soft enough to cut with a knife, shining silver, reacting violently with water. Potassium, even more reactive, bursting into flame when exposed to water. Davy also isolated calcium, magnesium, barium, strontium, demonstrating that electricity could break apart compounds that resisted other methods of decomposition. This electrochemical approach opened new possibilities, revealing elements that had been locked in compounds, showing that chemical bonds could be understood in terms of electrical forces. Jöns Jacob Berzelius in Sweden determined the atomic weights of many elements with remarkable accuracy. He analyzed thousands of compounds, carefully measuring their compositions. He introduced the system of using letter symbols for elements: H for hydrogen, O for oxygen, C for carbon. This notation made chemical formulas much simpler to write and understand. Water became H2O, showing its composition clearly and concisely. Berzelius also coined important chemical terms still used today. He distinguished between organic chemistry, the study of carbon-containing compounds associated with living things, and inorganic chemistry, the study of other substances, this division would prove somewhat artificial, but it reflected observed differences in how these compounds behaved. The discovery of new elements continued throughout the century. Some were found in rare minerals, extracted through painstaking chemical procedures. Others were detected through new analytical techniques, like spectroscopy, which revealed the presence of elements by the characteristic colors they produced when heated in a flame. Cesium and rubidium were discovered this way in the 1860s, identified by the unique lines in their emission spectra before anyone had isolated macroscopic samples. Helium was first detected in the sun's spectrum before being found on Earth. Its name derives from Helios, the Greek sun god. Patterns began to emerge as more elements were characterized. Certain elements seemed to have similar properties. Lithium, sodium, and potassium, all soft reactive metals, chlorine, bromine, and iodine, all reactive nonmetals that formed similar compounds. Investigators began arranging elements in various schemes, trying to find order in the growing list. Dmitry Mendeleev, a Russian chemist with wild hair and an unconventional spirit, made the breakthrough in 1869. He arranged elements by atomic weight, but left gaps where properties suggested elements should be. He predicted the properties of these missing elements with remarkable accuracy. When gallium was discovered a few years later, it matched his predictions almost exactly. His periodic table revealed that properties repeated at regular intervals. Chemical behavior was not random, but followed patterns based on atomic weight and structure. Elements in the same column had similar properties. The table had holes, suggesting undiscovered elements. It had an elegant logic that hinted at deeper underlying order. Mendeleev's table was not immediately accepted, but as predicted elements were discovered and found to match his descriptions, it became clearer that he had found something fundamental. The periodic table became the organizing framework for all of chemistry, a map of the elements showing relationships and patterns. Yet even as Mendeleev's table brought order to the elements, deeper questions remained. Why did elements have these specific properties? Why did the pattern repeat? What determined an element's chemical behavior? The answers would come from discoveries about the internal structure of atoms themselves. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered mysterious rays that could pass through paper and wood and even flesh, revealing the bones within. He called them X-rays, marking their unknown nature. These rays emerged when fast-moving electrons struck metal targets, though neither electrons nor their role were yet understood. The following year, Henri Becquerel in France discovered that uranium compounds emitted their own penetrating radiation without any external stimulation. Photographic plates wrapped in black paper were fogged when placed near uranium salts. Something was radiating from the uranium itself, constantly, inexplicably. Marie Curie, working with her husband Pierre in a cold, converted shed in Paris, investigated this phenomenon with intense determination. She coined the term radioactivity and set about measuring it in various substances. She found that the intensity of radiation was proportional to the amount of uranium present, suggesting it was an atomic property, not a molecular one, working through tons of pitch-blende ore. The Curies painstakingly isolated two new elements, both more radioactive than uranium. They named one polonium, after Marie's native Poland, and the other radium From the Latin word for ray, the work was physically exhausting, stirring boiling solutions with iron rods nearly as tall as Marie herself, breathing fumes, exposed to radiation they didn't yet understand as dangerous. Radium glowed in the dark with a soft blue-green light, its radiation continuing endlessly, seemingly violating the conservation of energy. Where was this energy coming from? The implications were staggering. The atom was not indivisible after all, not a solid, unchanging sphere as Dalton had imagined, but something more complex, something that could transform, releasing energy in the process. Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander working in England and Canada, investigated radioactive emissions, identifying two types: alpha particles, which could be stopped by paper, and beta particles, which penetrated further. A third type, gamma rays, similar to X-rays but more energetic, was identified by others. Rutherford showed that alpha particles were helium atoms stripped of their electrons, and that when radioactive elements emitted these particles, they transformed into different elements. Uranium slowly became thorium, which became another element, and so on down a chain of transformations. The alchemist's dream of transmutation was real after all, not achieved through chemical processes, but occurring spontaneously in certain elements. In 1911, Rutherford proposed a revolutionary model of atomic structure based on experiments where alpha particles were fired at thin gold foil. Most passed through, but occasionally one bounced back at a sharp angle. He concluded that atoms were mostly empty space, with a tiny dense nucleus at the center containing most of the mass, and electrons orbiting this nucleus like planets around a sun. This nuclear model explained many observations, but it created new puzzles. According to classical physics, orbiting electrons should continuously radiate energy and spiral into the nucleus in a fraction of a second. Atoms should be unstable, yet they persisted. Something was missing from the theory. Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist working with Rutherford, proposed that electrons could only exist in certain specific orbits, quantum states with discrete energies. Electrons could jump from one orbit to another, absorbing or emitting energy in precise amounts, but they could not exist between these allowed states. This quantum model explained the spectral lines of hydrogen beautifully. The specific wavelengths of light emitted corresponded exactly to the energy difference between allowed orbits. It was strange and unprecedented, imposing discrete jumps where classical physics predicted continuous change. But it matched experimental observations with uncanny precision. The understanding deepened through the 1920s and 30s. Louis de Broglie proposed that electrons had wave-like properties as well as particle-like properties. Werner Heisenberg and Erwin Schrödinger developed mathematical frameworks for quantum mechanics, describing electrons not as particles in definite orbits, but as wave functions, probability distributions showing where electrons were likely to be found. In this quantum world, electrons occupied orbitals, three-dimensional regions around the nucleus. The periodic table's pattern finally made sense. Elements in the same column had similar properties because they had the same number of electrons in their outermost orbitals. Chemical behavior was determined by these outer electrons, their arrangement, their availability for sharing or transferring to other atoms. The chemical bond itself came into focus. Gilbert Lewis proposed that atoms shared pairs of electrons to form covalent bonds, creating stable arrangements. This sharing explained why hydrogen formed H2 molecules, why oxygen formed O2, why water was H2O with the oxygen atom sharing electrons with two hydrogen atoms. Linus Pauling extended these ideas, describing how orbitals could blend or hybridize, explaining molecular shapes and bond strengths. He introduced the concept of electronegativity, a measure of how strongly an atom attracts electrons, allowing predictions about whether bonds would be ionic, with electrons transferred from one atom to another, or covalent, with electrons shared, or something in between. The 20th century saw chemistry expand in every direction. Organic chemistry grew enormously as chemists learned to synthesize complex molecules, creating dyes and drugs and plastics and countless other materials. The German chemical industry became dominant in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, producing synthetic indigo that replaced natural dye sources, creating aspirin and other pharmaceuticals, developing processes for industrial-scale production. Fritz Haber developed a process for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen, crucial for producing fertilizers and explosives. The process required high temperatures and pressures, with iron catalysts facilitating the reaction. It transformed agriculture, allowing the production of nitrogen fertilizers without relying on natural nitrate deposits, supporting a vast increase in food production, though also enabling modern warfare through abundant explosives. The same chemical knowledge that created fertilizers and medicines also produced poison gases used in World War I, chlorine and phosgene and mustard gas, drifting across battlefields, causing terrible suffering. Chemistry's power was neutral, capable of healing or harming, depending on human choices. This duality would become even more apparent as the century progressed. Polymers emerged as a major field. Leo Baekeland created the first fully synthetic plastic, Bakelite, in 1907, opening an era of materials that didn't exist in nature. Wallace Carruthers at DuPont developed nylon, the first fully synthetic fiber, strong enough to replace silk in parachutes, versatile enough to become ubiquitous in clothing and countless other applications. The understanding of chemical kinetics advanced. How fast do reactions proceed? What factors affect reaction rates, temperature, concentration, catalysts? Each variable could be studied, measured, related to the molecular processes underlying visible changes. Arrhenius developed equations relating temperature to reaction rate, explaining why chemical processes speed up when heated. Analytical chemistry became increasingly sophisticated. Instruments could detect and measure substances in tiny concentrations, spectroscopy in various forms, infrared, ultraviolet, nuclear magnetic resonance, each revealing different aspects of molecular structure. Mass spectrometry could determine molecular weights and fragment patterns, providing detailed structural information. Chromatography allowed separation of complex mixtures, components moving at different rates through a medium, emerging separately where they could be collected and analyzed. This technique became essential for analyzing everything from blood samples to environmental pollutants, from flavoring compounds to drugs. The electron microscope revealed structures at scales impossible with light. Viruses became visible. The detailed architecture of crystals could be examined. Later, scanning tunneling microscopes would allow imaging of individual atoms, making visible what Democritus could only imagine. those ultimate particles arranged in precise geometric patterns. Biochemistry emerged as a discipline, studying the chemical processes within living organisms. Enzymes were revealed as protein catalysts of extraordinary specificity and efficiency. The structure of proteins was gradually worked out, long chains of amino acids folding into precise three-dimensional shapes, their function depending on their form. The discovery of DNA's structure by Watson and Crick in 1953, building on Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography data, revealed the molecular basis of heredity. The double helix with its complementary base pairs explained how genetic information was stored and replicated. All of life's diversity ultimately came down to chemistry, to sequences of nucleotides encoding sequences of amino acids that folded into proteins that carried out the functions of life. Chemistry had come full circle, in a sense, from ancient attempts to understand life's essence through material transformation, through centuries of accumulated practical knowledge and theoretical development, to a molecular understanding of life itself, the mechanisms of inheritance, of metabolism, of cellular function, all revealed as chemistry, as the orchestrated interactions of molecules following the same principles that governed simpler reactions in flasks and beakers. Environmental chemistry emerged as pressing concerns. DDT and other persistent pesticides lead in gasoline and paint, acid rain from industrial emissions, the thinning ozone layer. Chemistry had created many of these problems, but chemistry also provided the understanding needed to address them, to measure pollutants, to understand their effects, to develop alternatives. The development of computational chemistry allowed prediction of molecular properties and reaction pathways. Powerful computers could solve the quantum mechanical equations approximately, modeling molecular structures and behaviors. Drugs could be designed on computers, tested virtually before any synthesis was attempted. Materials could be optimized. Reactions could be understood in unprecedented detail. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, chemistry had become deeply integrated with other sciences, materials science, nanotechnology, biochemistry, environmental science. The boundaries blurred as problems required interdisciplinary approaches. Yet the fundamental questions remained chemical. How do atoms and molecules interact? What determines structure and reactivity? How can we harness these principles to create desired outcomes? And beneath all the sophistication, all the advanced instruments and computational models, the core principles remain those discovered through centuries of patient observation, conservation of mass and energy, the periodic properties of elements, the quantum nature of matter, the relationship between structure and function. These principles, discovered through countless experiments in laboratories, quiet and bustling, in universities and industries, by individuals driven by curiosity or practical need, formed the foundation of our material world. The story of chemistry is not finished. New materials are being created, new drugs discovered, new processes developed. But perhaps there is value in pausing here, in this quiet moment, to contemplate what has been learned, to appreciate the journey from fire to quantum mechanics, from gold-seeking alchemists to genome-editing biochemists, all asking fundamentally similar questions about the nature of matter and transformation. The deeper one looks into chemistry, the more it reveals about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Every solid object, every liquid, every gas, is composed of particles in constant motion, vibrating, rotating, moving through space. Even when everything appears perfectly still, at room temperature, the molecules in the air are moving at speeds of hundreds of meters per second, colliding billions of times per second. Yet we perceive only stillness and silence. The water in a glass appears calm, but its molecules are in ceaseless agitation, hydrogen bonds forming and breaking in femtoseconds, a time scale so brief that light travels only a fraction of a hair's width. This hidden dynamism exists everywhere, in the wood of a table, in the fabric of clothing, in the cells of our bodies. Nothing is truly at rest. Everything participates in an endless molecular dance, following the laws of thermodynamics, tending toward equilibrium, yet capable of remarkable organization and order. Consider a snowflake, each one unique, yet each one following the same basic hexagonal symmetry. The shape emerges from the way water molecules bond to each other, from the angles determined by the arrangement of electrons around oxygen and hydrogen atoms, from quantum mechanics to ice crystal geometry, from the invisible to the visible. The connection is direct and beautiful. Or consider the colors we see. The blue of the sky results from how air molecules scatter sunlight, preferentially scattering shorter blue wavelengths. The red of a rose comes from pigment molecules that absorb certain wavelengths and reflect others. The green of leaves, chlorophyll molecules capturing photons and using their energy to drive chemical reactions that build sugars from carbon dioxide and water. Color itself is chemistry made visible. Every hue and shade arising from molecular structure, from the arrangement of atoms and the behavior of electrons. The sunset's orange and red, the ocean's varied blues, the infinite gradations of autumn leaves, all chemical phenomena, all expressions of how matter interacts with light. The energy that powers nearly everything on Earth's surface comes ultimately from nuclear reactions in the sun's core. Hydrogen fusing into helium, releasing energy that travels as light across space, to be captured by plants, to be stored in chemical bonds, to flow through food chains and ecosystems. Chemistry and physics intertwined, matter and energy in constant exchange. Even our thoughts and feelings have a chemical dimension. Neurotransmitters crossing synapses, hormones traveling through bloodstreams, proteins folding and unfolding in response to signals. The experience of consciousness emerges from chemistry, from the coordinated activity of molecules in the vast network of the brain. This doesn't diminish the mystery, but rather deepens it. How does chemistry become experience? How does matter become aware of itself? The question brings us back to ancient philosophical puzzles, but now with molecular specificity. We know which molecules are involved in memory formation, which ones create feelings of pleasure or pain, which ones regulate sleep and wakefulness. Yet the gap between knowing the mechanism and understanding the experience remains. Chemistry gives us the how, but not quite the why. Perhaps there is something profound in chemistry's insistence on transformation. Nothing is permanent. Everything is in flux. Iron rusts, diamonds can burn, even gold slowly exchanges atoms with its surroundings. The substance persists, but the particular atoms come and go, replaced gradually over time. Our own bodies demonstrate this. The calcium in our bones is not the same calcium that was there years ago. The carbon in our cells has been cycled through the atmosphere, through plants, through other organisms. We are temporary arrangements of atoms borrowed from the environment, assembled into the pattern of a human body, maintained through constant chemical work, eventually to be returned and redistributed. This view is both humbling and connecting. We are not separate from the material world, but continuous with it. The iron in our blood was forged in ancient stars. The oxygen we breathe was produced by photosynthesis. The water in our cells has cycled through clouds and rivers and oceans. We are made of the world, and we will return to it. Atoms persisting, patterns dissolving and reforming. Chemistry also teaches us about emergence, how properties arise that cannot be predicted from components alone. Hydrogen and oxygen, both gases, combine to form liquid water with properties utterly unlike either element, sodium, a metal that reacts violently with water, and chlorine, a poisonous gas, combine to form table salt, essential for life. The whole is genuinely different from the sum of parts. This emergence happens at every level. Atoms form molecules with new properties. Molecules form cells with the property of life. Cells form organisms with consciousness. At each level, new possibilities emerge, new behaviors, new phenomena that could not exist at simpler levels of organization, and yet the fundamental rules remain the same. The quantum mechanics governing electrons in atoms also governs electrons in molecules, in cells, in brains. The laws of thermodynamics apply to chemical reactions in beakers and to the complex metabolism of living organisms. Unity underlies diversity. Simple rules generate endless complexity. There is something almost musical about chemistry. Harmonic relationships in the periodic table, resonance structures in molecules, the rhythms of oscillating reactions, systems seeking equilibrium, sometimes overshooting and oscillating before settling, like waves gradually damping, like sounds fading into silence. The Belousov's Jabotinsky reaction demonstrates this beautifully, a mixture of chemicals that oscillates between colors, red and blue, back and forth, in waves spreading through the solution, pattern and rhythm emerging from chemistry alone, no life required, just the right combination of molecules and conditions, creating order from chaos, temporarily, before eventually running down toward equilibrium. All chemistry moves toward equilibrium, that state of maximum entropy, of uniform distribution, of no more potential for change. And yet, we exist far from equilibrium, maintained by constant flows of energy and matter, eating, breathing, burning fuel, dissipating heat, creating local order at the expense of increasing disorder elsewhere. Life itself is chemistry kept persistently out of equilibrium. A cell dies when it reaches equilibrium with its surroundings. Life requires difference, concentration gradients, energy flows, the ability to harness these differences to do work, to maintain organization, to repair damage, to grow and reproduce. This is the deep insight of thermodynamics. Order requires energy. Complexity requires work. The intricate beauty of living things, the precise folding of proteins, the replication of DNA, all sustained by energy flowing from high-quality sources like sunlight toward the low-quality heat of the universe. We are all participants in this vast flow, temporary eddies in the stream. And so, as these thoughts settle like dust motes finding stillness, as the images of laboratories and reactions and glowing elements fade into softer focus, there remains a quiet sense of connection to something vast and ancient. The same forces that combined hydrogen and helium in the first stars, that forged heavier elements in supernovae, that condensed matter into planets, that sparked the first self-replicating molecules, these forces continue their work in every breath, in every moment. Chemistry asks nothing of us but observation. It proceeds whether we understand it or not. Rust forms on iron, sugar dissolves in water, wood burns to ash. The universe goes on with its transformations, indifferent to our understanding, yet open to our investigation. There is comfort in this, in the reliability of natural law, in the consistency of chemical behavior. Water always freezes at the same temperature, under the same conditions. Hydrogen and oxygen always combine in the same proportions. The periodic table's pattern holds true everywhere we can observe, on Earth, in meteorites, in the spectra of distant stars. This universality suggests something profound, that the rules governing matter are not local, not arbitrary, but fundamental to the structure of reality itself. Chemistry would work the same way anywhere in the universe. The same elements would have the same properties. The same bonds would form. The same reactions would proceed. Somewhere, perhaps, on a planet circling a distant star, water might be flowing. Carbon-based molecules might be organizing into life. Chemistry working out its patterns in conditions we can barely imagine. The details would differ, but the underlying principles would be the same. This thought connects us to the cosmos, makes us less alone in the vastness. The story of chemistry is ultimately a story about change and continuity, about transformation within constancy. Elements persist even as they combine and recombine. Atoms remain even as molecules form and break apart. The fundamental particles endure through countless rearrangements. We ourselves are part of this story, not observers standing outside, but participants fully embedded in the chemical world. Our bodies are chemistry. Our thoughts emerge from chemistry. Our awareness, in this moment, reflecting on chemistry, is itself a chemical phenomenon. Neurons firing, neurotransmitters crossing gaps, electrical signals propagating through networks of cells. And yet knowing this doesn't diminish the wonder. If anything, it deepens it. The fact that matter, arranged in particular ways, following chemical and physical laws, can become aware, can ponder its own existence, can ask questions about the nature of reality. This seems almost miraculous, yet it is simply what chemistry does, given enough time, enough complexity, enough energy flowing through the system. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson, that there is no clear boundary between the living and the non-living, between the conscious and the unconscious, between spirit and matter, only different levels of organization, different degrees of complexity, all following the same fundamental rules, all part of the same continuous reality. The alchemists sought to perfect matter, to find the philosopher's stone, to achieve transmutation. In a sense, we are the transmutation they sought. We are matter that has become conscious of itself, atoms organized into patterns that can think and feel and wonder, the base metal of simple elements transformed into the gold of awareness. This transformation required no magical catalyst, no secret formula, only time and the patient working out of chemical and physical law. Billions of years of stars forming and exploding, of planets coalescing and evolving, of molecules combining and competing and gradually organizing into life, of nervous systems developing and consciousness emerging. And now, in this moment, chemistry continues. Oxygen is being transported through bloodstreams. Carbon dioxide is being released. Molecules are binding to receptors. Enzymes are catalyzing reactions. The vast coordinated chemistry of life proceeds, mostly unconscious, mostly automatic, requiring no deliberate thought or attention. The night deepens, or perhaps it is simply the thoughts that deepen, settling like sediment in a still water. The questions remain, but they feel less urgent now, less demanding of answers, content simply to exist, to be held gently in awareness. Chemistry will continue its patient work, in laboratory and in nature, in industry and in living cells, transforming substances, revealing new possibilities, creating materials that never existed before, solving problems, sometimes creating new ones, always exploring the space of what is possible within the constraints of physical law. But for now, there is just this quiet contemplation, this sense of connection to the material world, this appreciation for the elegant simplicity underlying endless complexity. The periodic table hangs in memory, elements arranged in their rows and columns, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of matter, each one playing its part in the ongoing story. The story has no end, only pauses, only moments of rest between transformations, and in this pause, in this stillness, there is everything and nothing, just the gentle awareness of being, of existing as a temporary pattern in the flow, of participating in chemistry's ancient dance. The words fade now, like the last light fading from the sky, like heat gradually dissipating into the surroundings, like a reaction approaching equilibrium. The story settles into silence, into the deep quiet, from which all things emerge and to which all things return. And there is only this moment, this breath, this gentle letting go. There is something about the way light falls across a canvas, something about the stillness of a studio in the early hours, when the world outside has not yet begun to move. And inside these quiet rooms, painters once stood before their easels, brushes poised, contemplating color and shadow and the infinite possibilities of what might emerge from nothing more than pigment and linseed oil. I find myself walking through the 19th century tonight, not as it existed in the rush of industry and empire, but as it lived in the studios of those who devoted themselves to capturing it, frame by frame, stroke by stroke, building entire worlds with their hands. The air in these imagined spaces feels different somehow, thick with the scent of turpentine and beeswax, dust motes suspended in shafts of northern light streaming through tall windows, the kind of light that painters prized above all else, steady and cool and unchanging throughout the long hours of work. I can almost see the worn floorboards, paint spattered and uneven, the tables cluttered with tubes of color squeezed and twisted, their metal bodies bearing the marks of countless applications, ochre and umber and vermilion and cobalt, names that sound like poetry when spoken slowly, each one a gateway to a different quality of seeing. These painters, these remarkable individuals who lived between 1790 and 1900, they witnessed a world transforming at unprecedented speed, railways cutting through countryside that had remained unchanged for centuries, cities swelling beyond recognition, photography emerging to challenge everything painting had been, And yet they continued day after day, returning to their canvases with a kind of devotion that borders on the sacred. There were so many of them, each with their own vision, their own understanding of what it meant to translate the visible world into something that could live forever on a flat surface. Some worked in sun-drenched fields, others in cluttered Parisian apartments, still others in grand ateliers where students gathered to learn the old techniques, the traditional methods passed down through generations. Tonight I want to walk among them, to move slowly through their world, to understand not just what they painted, but how they saw, what drew their eye, what made them choose one shade of green over another, one angle of light instead of the next. Because in these choices, in these thousands upon thousands of small decisions, entire philosophies of beauty were born. The century itself seems to unfold like a long gallery, room after room of different approaches, different schools of thought, beginning with those who painted in the grand manner, the history painters and portraitists who commanded enormous canvases and royal commissions, their work lit by candlelight in the salons of Europe, admired by crowds who came to see art that told stories, that elevated and educated and impressed. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. Painters started turning away from mythology and biblical scenes. They began looking instead at the world immediately around them, the ordinary made extraordinary through attention, through care, through the simple act of seeing what had always been there, but had somehow remained invisible. I think of the light in their studios again, how it must have changed throughout the day, morning brightness giving way to afternoon's golden warmth, then evening's violet shadows, and how a painter working on the same canvas across weeks or months would have seen it transform under these different conditions, would have had to make choices about which light was the truest, which version of reality to preserve. There is something profound in this, in the way these artists devoted entire lifetimes to the problem of representation, to the question of how to make paint on canvas feel alive, feel true, feel like more than just colored mud spread across woven fabric. And so I begin this slow journey, this unhurried exploration of their world, knowing that each painter I encounter will offer a different answer to the same fundamental questions. What is worth painting? How should it be painted? And what can art reveal that we might otherwise miss in the blur of simply living? The 19th century awaits, vast and varied, filled with more beauty and innovation than any single telling could capture. But here in this quiet space, with time moving at its own gentle pace, perhaps we can glimpse something of what these remarkable individuals saw and understood, and gave to us through their patient, persistent, transformative work. The century opens with painters still working in the long shadow of the past, still looking to Rome and Athens for their subjects, still believing that the highest calling of art was to depict gods and heroes, moments of classical virtue frozen in time, rendered with the precision and clarity that academies across Europe demanded of their students. In France, in those early years after the Revolution, Jacques-Louis David commanded enormous influence. His studio in Paris, a place where young artists gathered to learn the principles of neoclassicism, that style which prized order above all else, rational composition, clear lines, subjects drawn from history and mythology, everything calculated to inspire civic virtue and moral certainty. David's canvases from this period possess a kind of theatrical clarity, every figure positioned with geometric precision, every fold of cloth arranged to suggest marble sculpture, the colors cool and controlled, nothing left to chance or spontaneity. And his students absorbed these lessons, carried them forward into the new century, believing as he did that art should elevate and instruct, should stand apart from the messiness of everyday life. But even then, even in those opening years when neoclassicism seemed unassailable, other possibilities were stirring, other ways of seeing beginning to emerge in studios across Europe, in Spain. Francisco Goya worked in a register entirely his own, court painter to kings and witness to war. His early works displayed the technical brilliance expected of a royal portraitist, but something darker moved beneath those surfaces, something that would eventually burst forth in images of violence and nightmare, visions that seemed to come from some place the academies never acknowledged. Goya's portraits from the 1790s capture Spanish aristocracy with unflinching honesty. He painted the royal family in 1800, and while the composition follows traditional formulas, there is something unsettling in how he renders their faces, a psychological penetration that borders on cruel, as if he sees past the costumes and jewels to something more troubling underneath. And when war came to Spain, when Napoleon's forces invaded and the country descended into brutal conflict, Goya responded with images that shattered every convention about how violence should be depicted. His disasters of war etchings show bodies broken and piled, faces contorted in agony, scenes rendered with stark economy, no classical nobility, no redemptive meaning, just the terrible weight of what humans do to each other. This was painting moving toward something new, toward a willingness to confront subjects the academies preferred to ignore, toward an art that could contain darkness as well as light, chaos as well as order. In England, Joseph Mallord William Turner was beginning his own revolution, though it would unfold more gradually. His early works displayed the topographical precision expected of landscape painting in that era, ruins and abbeys rendered with architectural accuracy, compositions balanced according to established principles, everything the Royal Academy recognized as proper and accomplished. But Turner was obsessed with light, with atmosphere, with the way weather could transform a scene from moment to moment. And as the years progressed, as he gained hushed confidence and reputation, his paintings began to dissolve, solid forms giving way to veils of color and mist, the world reimagined as pure luminosity. By 1812, by 1815, Turner's canvases were becoming increasingly radical. His Hannibal crossing the Alps depicts the ancient general's army almost consumed by a vortex of storm, the historical subject merely an excuse to explore the overwhelming power of natural forces, tiny figures dwarfed by swirling darkness and bursts of light. Critics didn't always know what to make of these works. Some praised their ambition, while others complained they looked unfinished, sketchy, as if Turner had stopped before the painting was complete. But he was after something they couldn't quite grasp, not the imitation of nature, but the sensation of it, the feeling of standing before vastness, of being surrounded by weather and light in constant transformation. Across the Channel, in Germany, Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes of an entirely different character, where Turner pursued movement and dissolution. Friedrich created images of profound stillness, lone figures standing before mountains or ruined abbeys or endless seas, their backs turned to the viewer, gazing into distances we can only imagine. These paintings from the 1810s and 1820s operate as spiritual meditations. The natural world becomes a space for contemplation, for measuring human smallness against the infinite. Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog shows a man on a rocky peak, looking out over layers of mist-shrouded mountains. We see what he sees, but can never fully know his thoughts. His inner experience remains private, mysterious. There is something deeply romantic in this, in the way Friedrich's landscapes make room for solitude and introspection, for the sublime emotions that wild nature can provoke, terror and awe, and a kind of religious reverence that needs no church, just mountains and sky and the overwhelming sense of something greater than ourselves. In France, Theodore Géricault was pushing history painting toward contemporary tragedy. His massive canvas, The Raft of the Medusa, depicted a recent shipwreck, survivors stranded on a makeshift raft, bodies piled in various states of life and death. The composition pyramidal, like classical art, but the subject matter visceral and immediate and deeply disturbing. Géricault researched this painting with obsessive thoroughness. He interviewed survivors, visited morgues to study dead bodies, built a scale model of the raft. He wanted accuracy not for its own sake, but to make the horror feel real, to create a history painting about the present moment, about actual suffering rather than mythological allegory. The painting caused a sensation when exhibited in 1819. Some viewers found it too graphic, too political in its implicit critique of French naval incompetence. But Géricault had demonstrated that large-scale painting could address contemporary events, could find grandeur and meaning in recent tragedy rather than ancient myth. Eugène Delacroix absorbed these lessons and carried them further. His The Massacre at Chios depicted Greeks suffering under Ottoman violence. His Liberty Leading the People transformed the July Revolution of 1830 into an allegorical vision, a bare-breasted liberty striding over barricades, tricolor flag raised high, bodies of the fallen scattered beneath her feet. These were romantic paintings in the fullest sense, privileging emotion over reason, color over line, movement over stasis. Delacroix's brushwork was loose and energetic, his compositions dynamic rather than static, everything designed to provoke feeling, to sweep the viewer into the drama unfolding on canvas. The academies resisted this new direction. They still taught that drawing was superior to color, that composition should be carefully planned rather than improvised, that noble subjects demanded noble treatment, restrained and dignified. But the romantic painters were after something else. They wanted passion, intensity. They wanted art that could match the tumultuous character of their age. In England, John Constable was revolutionizing landscape, painting through obsessive attention to specific places, to the fields and streams and skies of his native Suffolk. He painted the same locations again and again, studying how light changed across seasons, how clouds built and dispersed, how water reflected the sky's moods. Constable's technique involved building up surfaces with thick applications of paint, sometimes using a palette knife to create texture. His skies were full of movement, masses of white and gray clouds suggesting weight and moisture. He wanted his landscapes to feel alive, to capture the freshness of direct observation rather than the stale formulas of studio composition. When his paintings were exhibited in Paris in the 1820s, they influenced a generation of French painters. That directness of approach, that willingness to make nature itself the subject without mythological pretense, it suggested possibilities that would flower in the decades to come. And in those same years, in rural France, in the village of Barbizon near the forest of Fontainebleau, painters were beginning to gather, drawn by the ancient woods and agricultural landscapes, seeking to paint nature directly, without classical embellishment, without the idealizing conventions the academies promoted. Théodore Rousseau, Jean-François Millet, Charles-François d'Aubigny, these artists of the Barbizon school worked outdoors, making studies from life, then completing larger canvases in their studios. They painted peasants working the land, forest interiors dappled with light, twilight scenes of cattle returning home, ordinary subjects treated with deep seriousness. Millet's The Gleaners shows 3 women bent over a harvested field, gathering leftover grain, their bodies forming a rhythmic pattern of labor, the horizon line high so we see them against vast expanses of wheat stubble. It is a painting about work, about poverty, about the dignity of rural life, presented without sentimentality or condescension. This was painting moving steadily toward realism, toward a conviction that contemporary life, even in its most humble manifestations, deserved the attention once reserved for gods and saints. The shift was gradual but inexorable, the century turning away from classical idealism, turning toward the world as it actually appeared, in all its beauty and harshness, its poetry and its plainness. The 1850s arrive, and with them a new assertiveness about what painting could be, about what deserved to be seen and celebrated on canvas. Gustave Courbet declared himself a realist, and meant it as a challenge, a rejection of everything the Salon and the Academy held sacred. No more gods, no more allegories, only the visible world rendered with unflinching honesty. Courbet's The Stone Breakers depicted 2 laborers, an old man and a young boy, breaking rocks by the roadside, their faces turned away, their bodies bent to thankless work. He painted them life-size, the scale traditionally reserved for historical or religious subjects, and in doing so he made a radical argument that these anonymous workers were as worthy of monumental treatment as any emperor or saint. The painting scandalized many viewers, not because of its technique, which was robust and confident, but because of its subject matter, because Courbet refused to beautify poverty or make labor picturesque. He showed it as it was, brutal and grinding and ordinary, the kind of scene people passed on country roads without a second thought, now impossible to ignore. His studio in Ornans became a kind of a headquarters for this new realism. He painted himself there in the painter's studio, a massive canvas showing the artist at his easel, surrounded by various figures, models, and patrons and friends. The painting subtitled A Real Allegory, that paradoxical phrase capturing something essential about what he was attempting, to make the real world allegorical simply by attending to it with sufficient seriousness. In Paris, in these same years, Edouard Manet was beginning his own campaign against academic conventions. Though his methods were more subtle, more rooted in the language of the old masters, even as he transformed it into something shockingly new. Manet studied the Spanish painters at the Louvre, Velázquez especially, absorbing their bold contrasts of light and dark, their flattened corporeal space, their refusal of unnecessary detail, and he brought these lessons to contemporary Parisian subjects. Café scenes and parks and boulevards, the modern city as it actually looked in the 1860s. Olympia caused an uproar at the Salon of 1865. The painting depicted a nude woman, a prostitute, clearly, reclining on white sheets, meeting the viewer's gaze with cool directness, a black servant bringing flowers, presumably from a client, everything rendered with shocking plainness, no mythological alibi, no softening of the transaction being implied. The pose referenced Titian's Venus of Urbino, that Renaissance masterpiece of idealized beauty, but where Titian's Venus embodied timeless femininity, Manet's Olympia was entirely of her moment. A working woman in modern Paris, her body pale against dark surroundings, painted with broad, flat areas of color rather than the subtle modeling academic technique, demanded. Critics attacked the painting viciously. They called it vulgar, ugly, unfinished. They objected to the way Manet had painted her skin without conventional shading, without the smooth transitions that made flesh look soft and inviting. But Manet was after a different kind of truth, not idealization but observation, not fantasy but fact. His luncheon on the grass had provoked similar outrage 2 years earlier, showing a nude woman sitting casually with two fully dressed men in a park, another woman bathing in the background, the spatial relationships deliberately flattened, the whole scene painted with that same bold simplification that made everything feel both immediate and strangely artificial. These paintings announced that modern life demanded modern techniques, that the old methods of smooth finish and illusionistic depth were inadequate for capturing the experience of contemporary Paris, the city of boulevards and department stores and public parks, of gaslight and railway stations and crowds moving through spaces designed for spectacle and commerce. And it was, in these years, the 1860s, sliding into the 1870s, that a group of younger painters began gathering, meeting at cafes, discussing these questions of how to paint the modern world, how to capture not just its appearance but its tempo, its light, its fundamental character as something new in human history. Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, Camille Pissarro, they painted together at La Grenouillère, a popular bathing spot on the Seine, setting up their easels side by side, attempting to capture the shimmer of sunlight on water, the movement of figures in summer leisure, the whole scene broken into patches of color, quick brushstrokes that suggested rather than described. This was painting moving outdoors in earnest, not just for studies but for finished works. The development of paint in tubes had made this newly possible. Artists could carry their materials into fields and forests, could work directly before the motif instead of relying on memory and studio convention. Monet became obsessed with this approach, with painting the same subject under different conditions of light and weather, haystacks and poplar trees and the facade of Rouen Cathedral, returning again and again to observe how morning light differed from afternoon, how fog transformed familiar forms into veils of gray and lavender, how winter snow created entirely different relationships of color and tone. His technique grew increasingly broken. individual brushstrokes visible, patches of pure color placed side by side rather than mixed on the palette. When seen up close, these paintings looked like abstract arrangements, but step back and they cohered into shimmering illusions of atmosphere and light, more convincing in their own way than any smooth academic finish. In 1874, the group organized their first independent exhibition, showing works the Salon had rejected or that they chose not to submit. Monet's Impression Sunrise gave the movement its name, though it was initially meant as an insult, a critic deriding these loose, sketchy works as mere impressions rather than finished paintings. But the artists embraced the term. It captured something essential about their project. They were after impressions, fleeting effects of light and color, the way a scene feels in a particular moment, rather than how it might be analyzed and reconstructed in a studio. They wanted to paint the experience of seeing, not just the things seen. Renoir brought a particular warmth to this approach. His paintings of Parisian leisure, balls and garden parties and cafe terraces, suffused with golden light, figures dappled with shadows from trees, everything suggesting pleasure and abundance, the new bourgeois Paris enjoying itself in public spaces. His luncheon of the boating party captures a group of friends gathered on a terrace overlooking the Seine, glasses of wine and plates of fruit scattered across a white tablecloth, figures in casual conversation, some leaning close, others gazing out at the river, the whole scene structured by alternating areas of light and shadow, warm oranges and cool blues creating spatial depth without linear perspective. Pissarro worked with similar techniques, but toward different ends. His street scenes of Paris, his views of Rouen and other provincial cities possess a more democratic character. He painted workers and markets, rainy days and ordinary traffic, finding beauty in the everyday commerce of urban life, in the rhythms of work and weather. And he painted the countryside around Pontoise with deep affection, orchards and kitchen gardens, peasants tending crops, village streets in different seasons, his brushwork building up surfaces with small touches of varied color, greens inflected with blue and yellow and violet, creating a sense of light filtering through leaves, of air moving across cultivated land. Edgar Degas stood somewhat apart from the others. He rarely painted outdoors, preferring to work in his studio from memory and quick sketches, but he shared their interest in modern subjects, in capturing contemporary Paris through fresh eyes, ballet dancers and laundresses, cafe singers and women bathing, moments of private absorption rendered with penetrating observation. Degas studied movement obsessively, dancers stretching at the bar, horses racing at Longchamp, laundresses pressing heavy irons across fabric. He understood bodies in space, how weight shifted, how gestures revealed character and mood, and he composed his paintings with daring asymmetry, figures cut off by the frame, viewpoints suggesting the casual glance rather than formal arrangement. His pastels, especially, those images of dancers in rehearsal, show his mastery of color and form, layers of vibrant chalk creating effects of extraordinary delicacy, tutus catching light, flesh tones modulated with green and blue shadows, everything suggesting the specific quality of gaslight in theaters, artificial illumination creating its own particular atmosphere. Berthe Morisot brought an intimate domesticity to Impressionism. Paintings of her daughter, of gardens and terraces, of women in interior spaces, her brushwork loose and confident, white dresses rendered with swift strokes of cream and gray and palest blue, capturing the play of light on fabric, on skin, on the surfaces of bourgeois comfort. She exhibited in almost all the Impressionist shows, the only woman to do so with such consistency, and her works possess a distinctive tenderness, attention to private moments, mothers with children, women reading or sewing, the quiet spaces of domestic life elevated through careful observation and lyrical handling of paint. Mary Cassatt, an American working in Paris, developed a similar focus, though her compositions showed the influence of Japanese prints, flattened space, bold outlines, unexpected cropping. She painted mothers and children with unsentimental affection, everyday interactions elevated through formal sophistication, a woman bathing a child, reading a story, simple moments made monumental through scale and composition. The Impressionists faced years of mockery and financial struggle, their paintings dismissed as unfinished, as hasty sketches, mistaken for art. But they persisted, organizing exhibition after exhibition, slowly building an audience that could see what they were attempting, could appreciate the freshness of their vision, the way they had captured something essential about modern experience. By the 1880s, Impressionism had begun to fracture, to evolve in different directions as individual painters pursued their own questions, their own dissatisfactions with what the movement had achieved, the unity of those first exhibitions giving way to more personal investigations. Georges Seurat took the Impressionist interest in color and light and subjected it to scientific analysis. He read treatises on optics, studied theories of color perception, and developed a technique he called divisionism, later known as pointillism, building entire paintings from tiny dots of pure color, each one distinct when viewed up close, merging into coherent forms when seen from proper distance. His A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte took 2 years to complete, every inch of the enormous canvas covered with small touches of paint, figures frozen in leisurely poses, umbrellas and boats and dogs, the whole scene possessing a monumental stillness despite its contemporary subject, as if Seurat had transformed a casual moment into something timeless through sheer methodical application. The painting divided critics. Some admired its systematic approach, its marriage of art and science. Others found it cold, mechanical, lacking the spontaneity that made Impressionism feel alive. But Seurat had demonstrated that the sketch-like techniques of his predecessors could be refined into something more deliberate, more controlled, without sacrificing luminosity. Paul Cézanne, meanwhile, was pursuing an entirely different revolution, working in isolation in Provence, painting Mont Sainte-Victoire again and again, studying how form emerges from color, how space can be constructed through careful modulation of warm and cool tones rather than traditional perspective. Cézanne's canvases from the 1880s and 90s look simple at first. Apples on a table, a few pine trees, a mountain seen from his studio, but the longer you observe them, the stranger they become. Tables tilted at impossible angles, multiple viewpoints combined in a single image, forms built from patches of color that seem to shift between flatness and depth. He was after something fundamental, trying to understand the basic structure of perception, how we translate the chaos of visual experience into coherent form. His brushstrokes became architectural, small parallel marks building up surfaces, creating rhythm and solidity, each painting a kind of meditation on the nature of seeing itself. Fellow painters began to recognize his importance. Younger artists made pilgrimages to Aix-en-Provence to meet him, to understand his methods. He told them to treat nature through the cylinder and the sphere and the cone, to find the geometric foundations underlying organic forms, advice that would echo through the next century. In Paris, in Montmartre, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec painted the city's nightlife with sardonic affection, cabarets and brothels, dancers and prostitutes, the demi-monde rendered with fluid lines and acid colors, his posters for the Moulin Rouge transforming commercial art into something genuinely innovative, bold silhouettes, flat areas of color, Japanese influence filtered through absinthe and gaslight. Lautrec's paintings possess a psychological acuity that can feel almost cruel. He saw through pretense, captured moments of weariness and calculation beneath the performance, a dancer adjusting her costume, a woman waiting for clients, everything rendered with economy and insight, his own physical limitations, his stunted growth from childhood accidents, perhaps sharpening his observation of those who sold their bodies for entertainment. Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris in 1886, his palette still dark from his Dutch period, paintings of peasants rendered in muddy browns and grays. But exposure to Impressionism transformed his approach. Color became brighter, more intense, his brushwork more energetic, swirling and pulsing with an urgency that reflected his turbulent inner life. He moved to Arles in 1888, seeking the intense light of southern France, and there his vision fully flowered, sunflowers blazing yellow against turquoise, wheat fields rippling under violent skies, cypresses twisting like dark flames, everything painted with passionate immediacy, thick applications of paint, creating surfaces that seem almost sculpted. Van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo reveal his thinking, his belief that color could express emotion directly, that complementary colors vibrating against each other could create effects more powerful than realistic representation. He wanted his paintings to console, to communicate feeling, to offer something of value to a world that had little use for him while he lived. The bedroom at Arles, the starry night, the flowering trees, these paintings from his final years possess an intensity that still feels overwhelming, as if the world has become purely expressive, every element charged with meaning and emotion, the distinction between inner and outer dissolved in swirling color and urgent mark-making. Paul Gauguin sought escape from European civilization entirely, first to Brittany, where he painted Breton peasants as if they were medieval figures, flattened forms outlined in dark, symbolic rather than naturalistic, then to Tahiti, where he imagined he might find an unspoiled, primitive paradise. His Tahitian paintings from the 1890s present an idealized vision of island life, women in sarongs lounging in tropical landscapes, colors intensified beyond nature, pinks and oranges and deep purples, everything arranged decoratively, less interested in optical truth than in creating images that felt mysterious, spiritual, connected to something primal and elemental. Gauguin rejected Impressionism's focus on fleeting effects. He wanted painting to address eternal questions, to tap into myths and symbols. His canvases combined Christian imagery with Polynesian motifs, creating a personal mythology that was part fantasy, part genuine engagement with Tahitian culture, though always filtered through European romantic projection. In England, the American expatriate James McNeill Whistler was developing his own aesthetic, paintings titled as Nocturnes and Symphonies, emphasizing their kinship with music, their existence as arrangements of color and tone rather than representations of specific places. His nocturne in black and gold showed fireworks over the Thames, the painting almost abstract, touches of gold against dark, the subject barely discernible. When the critic John Ruskin accused him of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, Whistler sued for libel. The trial became a debate about the nature of art itself, whether a painting's value resided in the hours spent making it or in the artistic vision it embodied. Whistler won, but was awarded only a farthing in damages. The legal costs bankrupted him. Yet he had made his point that painting need not be about faithful representation, that it could aspire to the condition of music, pure arrangement, form and color existing for their own sake. John Singer Sargent dominated portrait painting in these decades, his technique dazzling. He could capture a face with a few swift strokes, render silk and satin with breathtaking virtuosity. His society portraits showed the wealthy and powerful in all their assured elegance, though occasionally, as in Madame Aki, his psychological penetration created scandal. But Sargent also painted watercolors of extraordinary freshness, architectural studies in Venice, figures resting in gardens. These looser works revealing his pure pleasure in paint, in capturing effects of light and shadow so without the constraints of formal portraiture. Quick notations of seeing that feel utterly contemporary even now. The century drew toward its close, and painting had transformed beyond recognition. The academic certainties of 1800 dissolved, replaced by multiple competing visions, multiple ways of understanding what a painting could be and do. Symbolist painters like Gustave Moreau created canvases dense with mythological imagery, jeweled surfaces, dreamlike narratives, while Nabis artists like Pierre Bonnard and Edouard Vuillard painted intimate domestic scenes, wallpapered rooms, women sewing, everyday life transfigured through pattern and color. In Scandinavia, Edvard Munch was painting anxiety and desire, his The Scream capturing existential dread in swirling lines and acid colors. A figure on a bridge, hands to face, mouth open in silent anguish, the landscape behind warping into undulating bands of orange and blue, as if the world itself vibrates with unbearable feeling. Each painter now seemed to be inventing their own language, their own way of translating experience into paint, the unified styles of earlier academies replaced by radical individualism, by the conviction that art should express personal vision rather than conform to collective standards. The 19th century had begun with painters looking backward, drawing inspiration from classical antiquity, seeking to perpetuate traditions centuries old, but it ended with artists facing forward, embracing the new, the subjective, the experimental, willing to sacrifice beauty for truth, harmony for expression, acceptance for authenticity. And in their studios, in Paris and London and Munich and beyond, painters were already beginning the experiments that would define the coming century, already pushing toward abstraction, toward cubism and fauvism and expressionism, procuring the seeds of modernism planted in these final years, germinating in the minds of those who had learned from Cézanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin that painting need not mirror the world, that it could remake it, reimagine it, reveal dimensions of experience that had no other means of expression. The light in those studios, that patient northern light, continued to fall across canvases, across pellets loaded with color, across hands holding brushes, and the work continued as it always had, as it always would, one stroke following another, building worlds from pigment and vision, from observation and imagination, from the inexhaustible human need to see and to show and to understand through the slow, patient accumulation of marks on surface. The question of what these painters were actually doing, what they believed they were accomplishing in those hours of patient application, deserves deeper consideration, because they were not simply recording what they saw. They were constructing entire philosophies of vision, entire theories of how the visible world relates to human consciousness and experience. Consider the simple act of choosing a subject. Monet, standing before a haystack, deciding that this ordinary agricultural form contains within it something worth sustained attention, worth returning to again and again across seasons. That decision itself represents a radical revaluation of what matters, what deserves to be seen and celebrated and preserved. The haystack becomes a kind of collaborator in the investigation, its surface catching light differently at dawn than at noon than at dusk, its cylindrical form creating shadows that shift as the sun arcs across the sky. Monet was not painting haystacks. He was painting time itself, the way moments accumulate into days, the way looking closely at anything reveals infinite variation. And this sustained attention requires a kind of love, or at least a deep curiosity about the nature of appearance, because the eye must be convinced to see past habit, past the mental shortcuts that allow us to navigate the world efficiently, but blind us to its actual character, its moment-by-moment transformation. The Impressionists trained themselves to see like children, or like people who had just gained sight after a lifetime of blindness, to notice the violet shadows on snow, the orange reflections in water at sunset, the way flesh is never simply pink, but contains greens and blues and yellows, all the colors the mind edits out in the interest of recognizing skin as a category rather than experiencing it as a phenomenon. This required unlearning as much as learning, setting aside the formulas taught in academies, the received wisdom about how trees should be painted or water or sky, trusting instead the direct report of the senses, however strange or counterintuitive that report might seem. Cézanne took this project even further, deeper into the structure of perception itself. He understood that we do not see the world from a single fixed point. Our eyes move constantly, our head shifts, our body sways slightly, and our mind assembles these multiple glimpses into a coherent image that actually represents a synthesis, a construction, not a pure recording. So his paintings incorporate this movement, show objects from slightly different angles simultaneously, create space through color relationships rather than linear perspective, the mountain seen from here and also from there, the table both flat and tilted, everything true to the actual process of seeing, even as it violates the conventions of pictorial representation. This is painting as a form of epistemology, a way of investigating how we know what we know, how visual information becomes understanding, how patches of color and degrees of lightness resolve into the experience of a three-dimensional world populated with objects and space and atmosphere, And there is something profound in the way these painters devoted their lives to questions that could never be fully answered, because light is infinite in its variations, because no two moments are ever precisely the same, because the world continuously offers more than any painting can contain, and yet the attempt must be made, the effort itself constituting a kind of meaning. Van Gogh understood this. His letters speak of wanting to paint infinity, to suggest through color and movement something that transcends the physical scene. A cypress tree becomes a dark flame reaching toward heaven. A wheat field becomes a symbol of life's abundance and fragility. Everything charged with significance beyond its literal identity. His paintings feel urgent because he knew his time was limited, felt the pressure of everything he wanted to express, needed to communicate, and so the paint goes on thickly, swirling, pulsing, as if the canvas cannot contain the energy he pours into it, as if the world itself vibrates with more meaning than any single work can hold. This urgency stands in contrast to Cézanne's patient deliberation, his willingness to work on a single painting for months or years, adding small touches, reconsidering relationships, seeking a balance that satisfied his exacting sense of structure. Both approaches equally valid, equally necessary, different temperaments, finding different paths to similar goals. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of 19th century painting, that there is no single correct way to see, no single truth about appearance, only individual visions, each partial, each revealing something the others miss, Monet's shimmer and Cézanne's solidity, and Van Gogh's expressiveness and Degas' psychological acuity, all needed, all contributing to a larger understanding of what painting can be and do. The studios where this work happened were not romantic garrets. Well, some were, but many were professional spaces, organized for the practical business of making art, tables for mixing paint, north-facing windows for consistent light, storage for canvases and stretchers and frames, the physical infrastructure required for sustained creative production. And the painters themselves were not isolated geniuses. They were part of communities, arguing in cafes, writing letters, visiting each other's studios, learning from and influencing one another. Art emerging from conversation and collaboration as much as from solitary inspiration. This social dimension matters, because painting in the 19th century was also about building alternative structures, creating exhibition spaces outside official channels, developing markets that did not depend on academic approval, establishing the possibility of artistic independence, of making work according to personal conviction rather than institutional expectation. The Impressionist exhibitions, the Salon des Refusés, the independent galleries, these were not just venues for showing art. They were assertions of autonomy, declarations that painters could determine for themselves what mattered, could address audiences directly without institutional mediation, and slowly, gradually, over decades, this independence became normalized. The idea that artists should be free to pursue their vision, however unconventional, however challenging to established taste. This became part of the culture's understanding of what art is and how it functions. The 19th century gave us this gift, this expansion of possibility, this multiplication of approaches, so that by 1900 painting contained multitudes, realism and symbolism and impressionism and post-impressionism and countless individual variations, each valid, each offering its own particular insight. And now, at this late hour, with the century closed and its painters long since gone, their canvases remain, hanging in museums and private collections, still capable of stopping us in our tracks, still able to make us see differently. I think of standing before a Monet, how the surface dissolves up close into pure abstraction, just color and texture, and then stepping back, watching it cohere into water lilies floating on a pond, light filtering through willow branches, the miracle of representation emerging from chaos, from the accumulation of individual marks, each one a small decision, a commitment to a particular hue, a specific placement, or a Cézanne still life, apples on a table. Such a simple subject, and yet the longer you look, the more complex it becomes. The way the table seems to tilt, the way space compresses and expands, the way color creates form. You could spend hours with a single painting and not exhaust its possibilities, not fully grasp all the relationships Cézanne has orchestrated. This is what these painters left us, not just beautiful objects, though many are beautiful, but new ways of attending to the world, new possibilities for awareness. They trained themselves to see, and in doing so, trained us, expanded our capacity for noticing, for appreciating, for finding meaning in light and color and form. The studios are empty now, the palettes cleaned, the brushes laid down, but the work persists, continues to teach, continues to offer its particular kind of knowledge, the knowledge that comes through looking, through patient, sustained attention to appearance, through the willingness to be surprised by what is right in front of us. I imagine those painters, Monet in his garden at Giverny, Cézanne on the hillside above Aix, Berthe Morisot in her Paris apartment, all of them engaged in the same essential activity, trying to translate the visible world into something that could be shared, could be preserved, could speak to people they would never meet in times they could not imagine. And here we are, more than a century later, still receiving that communication, still standing before their canvases, still learning to see through their eyes, still grateful for their dedication, their persistence, their refusal to accept that the old ways were the only ways. That tradition should constrain vision. The light continues to fall, even now, across fields and cities, across water and mountains, across all the surfaces of the world, and somewhere people are still painting, still trying to capture something of that light, still engaged in the ancient patient work of making images, continuing conversations these 19th century masters began. Their voices fade now into the general silence, into the accumulated history of art, but they are not lost. They persist in every painting made with attention, in every attempt to see clearly, to honor what appears, to find in the visible world something worth preserving. The canvases wait in their museums, in their quiet galleries, patient as the painters who made them, ready to speak to anyone willing to look, to stand still long enough to receive what they offer, these windows into other ways of seeing, these invitations to notice, to appreciate, to understand through the eloquent, silent language of paint on surface. And perhaps that is enough, perhaps that is everything, to have seen clearly, to have recorded faithfully, to have found in ordinary subjects, in light and shadow and color, something extraordinary, something that justifies the hours, the years, the lifetimes spent in studios before easels, seeking always that next stroke, that next color, that next small step toward capturing what cannot quite be captured, but must nonetheless be attempted. The attempt itself, the sustained effort, the daily return to the work. This is the real subject, the deepest meaning, not the finished paintings, beautiful as they are, but the process, the practice, the commitment to seeing, to making, to offering what vision discovers to a world that might not immediately understand, but might someday, in time, come to value what these patient, dedicated souls created. And so the story ends where it began, with light falling across canvas, with painters long gone, but their work remaining, with the quiet knowledge that some things persist, some efforts bear fruit across generations, some seeing changes how we all see. Forever, the studios are dark now, the windows closed, but the paintings glow still. In galleries, in books, in memory, continuing their patient work of teaching us to see, to notice, to attend to the inexhaustible beauty of the visible world